Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this video kindly sponsored by REC Watches, combining historical aircraft preservation and restoration with a rather nice watch, if I do say so myself. Back in the late 1930s, one Australian, Pat Hughes, enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force, but he then decided to transfer to the Royal Air Force because he thought life in Britain might be a little bit more exciting, and he was right. Just a few short years after he arrived in the UK, World War II broke out, and he found himself fighting on the front lines of the Battle of Britain. And it turned out the Luftwaffe had really picked on the wrong Australian, because in the space of just 2 months he racked up no less than 17 victories, most of them against enemy fighters flying Spitfire X4009. But in early September 1940, his aircraft was seen to hit a Dornier 17. He bailed out, but his parachute failed to open. Like so many other downed fighters, X4009's wreck was buried, but in more recent years it's been recovered and is currently undergoing restoration to flying status. And so REC Watches have partnered with the Hunter Fighter Collection, which is doing the restoration, to help X4009 fly again. Each watch contains a small bit of metal from X4009 that couldn't otherwise be used to restore it to flying condition, with some of the proceeds from the sale of the watches going to help X4009 fly again. If you'd like to grab one, there are several colours, then you can use the link below and the code DRAC, which will get you a discount on the watch. So thanks very much to REC Watches for their continued support of the channel. And now I pass you on to the main event. So welcome ladies and gentlemen to the channel's first compilation. So this is all 3 episodes of the Battle of Jutland put together into one long documentary. Don't worry, I haven't taken down the originals, you can still go and watch them. This is purely for those of you who just want to listen to the whole thing through without having to worry about skipping through multiple videos and that kind of stuff. Originally I did actually want to remaster all the audio and so forth. Unfortunately, I've made these particular videos so many generations of video editor before that it just does not want to play ball. But you know, the videos are still pretty good, so enjoy. It would be the single biggest clash of gunline battle fleets the world had ever seen. It would remain one of the largest fleet actions the world would ever see, eclipsed only by a scarce few fought later in World War II. It is, of course, the Battle of Jutland. World War I is dominated in the popular mindset by the endless slaughter of the trenches on the Western Front. But there were many, many other theatres to the conflict. There were numerous engagements between various colonies of the involved powers that on their own would qualify as full-out wars if it were not for the fact that they were fought in the context of a much larger conflict that happened to be taking place at the same time. There was, of course, the somewhat more mobile war in the east between the Central Powers and Russia, the brutal Alpine conflicts on the Italian border, and the utterly unsurprising swirl of conflicting interests and changing sides that was the Balkans. There were, of course, numerous battles with the Ottoman Empire as well, including Gallipoli and the Levant campaigns, the desperate struggle between merchants and submarines in the Atlantic, and, of course, the actions of various navies across the world's oceans across the span of the war. Whilst it is sometimes overlooked, the naval conflict was no less vital than the struggle in the trenches. Whilst Germany's war industry was formidable, both it and the German economy as a whole relied on the global trade network for key resources that were not easily replaced. Everything from certain types of food to component materials for explosives and rare metals. With access to these supplies, Germany would be considerably stronger. Without them, if a decision could not be achieved on land, Germany was on a countdown to economic and literal starvation. Whilst the advent of submarines and minefields had deprived the Royal Navy of its traditional close blockade strategy that had served it for almost 2 centuries, the more distant blockade it now maintained in the North Sea and English Channel was still a boot on the German throat that was gradually pressing down harder and harder. As a counter to this stood the High Seas Fleet. 2 decades earlier, the German Navy had scarcely been more than a glorified coastal defence force, but now it stood as the second most powerful navy on the planet,
having eclipsed the traditional number 2 and number 3 navies for the past century, France and Russia, to a point where, on paper, the High Seas Fleet battle line outnumbered both of these fleets combined. Still, by 1916, even this potent force of 16 modern dreadnought battleships and 5 battlecruisers stood in the shadow of the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, 28 dreadnought battleships and 10 battlecruisers when at full strength. So a direct challenge was out of the question. However, British naval strategy had weaknesses. For centuries it had based its home fleets in the Channel and the Thames, close to European enemies and also able to guard its own coast against incursion. But the rapidly advancing technologies of the early 20th century had forced a sudden change. The old ports were too close to the potential threats of submarines, mines, and rapid incursion from enemy fleets. Work had begun on converting a huge natural anchorage in Scapa Flow, much further north, into a secure base. But at the start of the war, this work was not complete, and for a while the fleet had actually withdrawn as far as Ireland to remain safe. And even here, the super-dreadnought HMS Audacious had fallen victim to a recently laid German mine and poor damage control. The Grand Fleet had eventually moved into Scapa Flow, but the old reliance on the Navy as the shield of the United Kingdom meant that coastal defences were generally hopelessly obsolete, and in many cases pretty much non-existent. This gave the High Seas Fleet an opportunity. Using the fast ships of the first scouting group, they could dash out and reach the poorly defended English coast far faster than any sortie from Scapa Flow. They could then bombard English towns with near impunity, knowing that the Harwich force of cruisers and light destroyers stood little chance, if unsupported, against the cruisers and battlecruisers of First Scouting Group. The only British formation fast enough and powerful enough to challenge them was the Battlecruiser fleet. So the idea was to provoke this powerful formation into coming south alone, whereupon the First Scouting Group would fall back onto the High Seas Fleet, which would be waiting further offshore. The combined German forces would then annihilate the Battlecruiser fleet, along with any single squadron of battleships that might have been sent to support it, leaving the British fleet without an effective fleet screen and reducing the capital ship odds from around 1.8 to 1 to a more manageable 1.3 or 1.4 to 1. In ideal circumstances, the British would seek to ensure their own ship superiority over the First Scouting Group by supplementing the Battlecruiser fleet with a squadron of battleships, because they had them spare. The German fleet, however, could still overpower this formation, and the odds would be further reduced to about 1.15 to 1 if an entire battle squadron was destroyed, which was almost even. And at those odds, the Germans were fairly confident they could overcome the Grand Fleet, especially as the other part of the plan involved the use of U-boats to damage or destroy ships in any substantial British sortie before they reached the High Seas Fleet, which might even buy the Germans numerical superiority for a given engagement, assuming they'd managed to take care of the Battlecruiser fleet and a supporting battle squadron first. To a degree, this strategy actually worked. The raids forced the deployment of the Battlecruiser fleet further south to the more confined anchorages in the Firth of Forth, and at one point the Battlecruiser fleet did attempt to intercept the First Scouting Group with a single battle squadron under Vice Admiral Warrender nearby. This was the perfect scenario for the Germans, as the entire High Seas Fleet was lying in wait. But matters conspired to turn this engagement into a huge missed opportunity, and the British ships would live to fight another day. But this strategy was to have two effects which would go on to have huge impacts in the eventual major clash of the fleets. In the confined anchorage that the Battlecruiser fleet now found itself in, long-range gunnery practice was not anywhere near as easy as it was in Scapa Flow. As a result, emphasis was instead focused on rate of fire, the theory being that if you fired enough shells quickly enough, you'd find the eventual range by trial and error, following which a rapid cannonade would hopefully see the enemy destroyed. To this end, more ammunition was needed than the shell hoists could supply on a given minute, and soon flash protection doors in the system were being removed or left open to speed the passage of shells and charges, and still more explosives were being piled in the turrets and handling chambers directly below in order to give a ready stock of munitions for rapid fire. A set of decisions that would end up having fatal consequences further down the line. On the other hand, during one of the raids, the Battlecruiser Seydlitz had taken a hit to one of its aft turrets, setting off a chain reaction that saw a towering column of roaring fire turn the turret into an inferno and very nearly destroy the ship in a shattering magazine explosion. Only the quick, and in some cases last, actions of the crew saved the ship from this fate, and the lessons of good ammunition handling practice were rapidly absorbed and disseminated into the rest of the High Seas Fleet. Factored into these ongoing efforts was that, as 1916 started, the current commander of the High Seas Fleet, Admiral von Pohl, became ill and was replaced by Admiral Reinhard Scheer. Whilst von Pohl had been cautious, indeed, many in the German Navy said too cautious, and he had perhaps missed a number of opportunities, with the High Seas Fleet never straying more than about 120 to 130 miles from safe harbour during his tenure, Scheer was firmly of the opinion that his ships and men were better built and better led than the Grand Fleet, and that the High Seas Fleet should seek to take on the British as soon as possible, of course in favourable circumstances. He summarised his strategy as follows.
Our objective must be to damage the English fleet by offensive raids against the naval forces engaged in watching and blockading the German Bight, as well as by mine-laying on the British coast and submarine attack, whenever possible. After an equality of strength had been realized as a result of these operations, and all our forces have been made ready and concentrated, an attempt was to be made with our fleet to seek battle under circumstances unfavorable to the enemy.
Circumstances in 1916 continued to develop. At the end of April, after protests from the USA and others, the U-boats had been ordered to follow traditional prize rules instead of taking targets of opportunity unawares. This limited their effectiveness, and so Scheer directed that a number of them be taken from the anti-merchant campaign and instead redeployed against the Royal Navy. Additionally, the scouting capabilities granted by the German Zeppelin air fleet would be utilised to find and report on the location of the Grand Fleet, giving Scheer the opportunity to perfectly place his forces in ambush. This would result in the cascade reaction described previously that would bring the Royal Navy to battle on the High Seas Fleet's terms. With the previous efforts to reduce the Royal Navy piecemeal having failed, it was hoped that this new combination of Zeppelins, increased numbers of U-boats, and a more aggressive use of the High Seas Fleet would allow victory in a single combined operation, which was then scheduled for the middle of May 1916, allowing for repairs to the aforementioned Seydlitz. 10 U-boats were deployed, 2 to target the Grand Fleet and 8 to torpedo the Battlecruiser fleet as it emerged, whilst another 10 were dispatched on a variety of scouting, mine-laying and flank guarding missions. Unfortunately, delays to repairs on Seydlitz meant that the operation had to be moved to the end of the month, but this started to cause other issues. The U-boats had a limited amount of endurance, and that was starting to run out with a 2-week delay. The weather was also changing, with dense spring fogs rolling in which affected both the submarine's ability to see through their periscopes, as well as the ability of Zeppelins to operate safely and/or see anything of any benefit. The sea had also abandoned any pretense of normal behaviour, alternating between a flat calm, in which the ripple of a periscope was easy to spot and was virtually unheard of in the North Sea, and a more typical raging series of storms that at times threatened to physically hurl the U-boats from the depths. As a result, the activity of the various U-boats began to be noticed, patrols were stepped up, and submarines began to be chased off or damaged in operational incidents. Whilst the U-boat issues were not immediately realised, since of course they weren't about to start radioing in their situation from just off the British coast, the lack of aerial recon from the Zeppelins resulted in a change of plan. Instead of raiding the British coast again, the High Seas Fleet would instead head into the area of the North Sea near the Jutland Peninsula, or Skagerrak as the Germans and other locals called it. Here they could lay about British merchant ships and their escorts, and their position would give them more notice of British movements, and due to being closer to home, their own light screening forces, such as destroyers and torpedo boats, would be more able to conduct recon ahead of the fleet than if they were operating towards the extremity of their range. Thus, on the 30th of May 1916, the signal was sent to begin the revised operation the next day, the 31st. Signals were sent out to whatever U-boats were still active to be ready, although they weren't to know it, only 2 of these vessels would actually receive the signal. However, there was one other unknown problem with the plan: the British. Specifically, Room 40, who, ever since the early recovery of pretty much every German naval codebook that was relevant, had been happily decoding German naval radio transmissions, and was therefore able to inform the Royal Navy that a major German fleet operation was about to commence. Whilst the exact details of the German plan were unknown, Admiral John Jellicoe aboard HMS Iron Duke was not about to take any chances, and determined to take the Grand Fleet to a position just off the Norwegian coast, with the Battlecruiser fleet scouting ahead, allowing them to detect and counter almost any meaningful move that the German fleet might make. Due to the intercepted signals from the 30th of May telling them that the German operation would start the next day, the Grand Fleet began to raise steam and left Scapa Flow at about 10:30 at night on the 30th of May. Ironically, heading out to counter a German fleet operation several hours before the Germans themselves left port in order to conduct said operation. Some weeks before, the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron had been rotated up to Scapa Flow for some much-needed gunnery practice, and the modern, fast Queen Elizabeth-class battleships that made up the 5th Battle Squadron had been sent south to make up the numbers in the Battlecruiser fleet. Thus, Jellicoe would lead 16 battleships of the 1st and 4th Battle Squadrons and 3 battlecruisers of the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron out to sea. 2.5 hours later, in the early morning darkness, the 2nd Battle Squadron of 8 more battleships slipped into formation out at sea with the rest of the fleet. As this meetup was taking place, Admiral Hipper's 5 battlecruisers of the 1st Scouting Group were only just leaving the outer Jade Roads, with Hipper commanding from the brand new battlecruiser SMS Lutzow, along with his flag officer, 1 Lieutenant Commander Erich Raeder. An hour and a half later, the main High Seas Fleet battle line headed out to sea. 16 battleships of the 1st and 3rd Battle Squadrons led by Admiral Scheer aboard SMS Friedrich de Grosse, to be joined 90 minutes later by the 6 pre-dreadnoughts of the 2nd Battle Squadron. This latter force was not favoured by Scheer, who viewed their slow speed and limited armament as something of a liability, but he had included them after Admiral Mauve, their commander, had begged him not to be left out of the anticipated Great Battle, albeit that in the rest of the fleet they were known as the 5-Minuten-Schiff, or 5-minute ships, because that was about as long as anyone expected them to last in a battle between dreadnoughts. Last to depart was the Battlecruiser fleet. Being based much further south, they needed much less time to reach their assigned position. 6 battlecruisers of the 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons leading 4 battleships of the 5th Battle Squadron, led by Admiral Beatty, aboard HMS Lion. All major forces were sailing in column abreast. This served to keep formations closer together and enabled the quick passage of signals, which were still largely executed by flags and thus required the visual sighting of the commander's communications, or at least the sighting of a relay ship. Once they were confident of imminent combat, the various fleets would adopt the standard line of battle column formation, but this was a more unwieldy arrangement, so it was vital that the deployment be carried out based on accurate intelligence, so that the line of capital ships would intersect the enemy at a favourable angle. The worst nightmare of any admiral was to find his column sailing perpendicular to the enemy line. Whilst that may have worked for Nelson over a century earlier, in the modern age of long-range gunnery and explosive shells, it was an invitation to have your fleet destroyed bit by bit, as the firepower of every enemy battleship on the field would be focused on a small element of your own, whose wreckage would then disrupt the formation and gunnery of the next squadron that you'd be feeding into the grinder. Due to a number of ships on both sides being in refit, repair, or fitting out, not every capital ship that each fleet technically possessed on paper was available for the operation. On the British side, 4 battleships, HMS Queen Elizabeth, HMS Royal Sovereign, HMS Emperor of India, and HMS Dreadnought herself were unavailable. Queen Elizabeth and Emperor of India were in dock. Royal Sovereign had only just commissioned and was in the process of working up, whilst Dreadnought had been sent south to help guard the Thames estuary, along with Third Battle Squadron, which was made up of pre-dreadnoughts. Additionally, the battlecruiser HMAS Australia was in dock for repairs after having collided with HMS New Zealand. On the German side, SMS König Albert was in dock for repairs to its power plant, and SMS Bayern, the sole 15-inch armed ship in the High Seas Fleet at this point, was, like Royal Sovereign, still working up. This left a total strength on both sides as follows. Dreadnought battleships, 28 British, 16 German. Pre-dreadnoughts, no British, 6 German. Battlecruisers, 9 British, 5 German. Armoured cruisers, 8 British, no German. Light cruisers, 26 British, 11 German. Destroyers, 79 British and 61 German. And seaplane carriers, 2 British and no German. These last 2 were the seaplane tenders HMS Engadine and Campania, assigned to the battlecruiser fleet and the Grand Fleet respectively. But when it comes to aircraft and their carriers, let's ask the expert.
At Jutland, the British Grand Fleet possessed 2 seaplane carriers in its order of battle, HMS Campania and HMS Engadine. Before we have a look at those 2, it serves mentioning how the use of seaplane carriers differs from those ordinary carriers that would follow them, which we are used to today. Now, unlike the post-World War I flat-top, seaplane carriers would not launch their aircraft from the deck, but had to lift them off the deck onto the sea, where the plane then would take off itself. The same applied to landings, albeit reversed. Since the first use in combat at the siege of Tsingtao by the Japanese, seaplane carriers and the use of aviation began to be taken serious in naval warfare, but the practical value was still limited. In rough seas, for example, it was impossible to deploy a plane without it sinking or smashing against the hull of the ship. HMS Campania, perhaps the most modern of the British seaplane carriers, did not sail out towards Jutland. When the fleet left its anchorage, Campania did not, most likely due to a breakdown in communication, sail out from Scapa Flow as intended. And once this mistake was realized, she of course set out immediately before being ordered to turn back, as heading out alone was deemed too risky, as her limited speed would not allow her to catch up anyway. The Battle of Jutland would thus be fought without the more capable of British seaplane carriers.
Also missing from the British forces were the 35 destroyers and supporting light cruisers of the Harwich Force under Admiral Tyrwhitt, stationed much further south to defend the Channel along with 3rd Battle Squadron, but in different ports. They were available to flank the German lines if the Admiralty would issue the relevant orders. As the early morning darkness began to show the first glimmers of sunlight, the first actions of what would become known as the Battle of Jutland were about to begin. Submarine U-32 sights the cruisers HMS Galatia and Phaeton screening elements of the battlecruiser fleet, proceeding at 18 knots. It fires a single torpedo, which misses, but the periscope jams in the raised position, giving away its position. One cruiser turns to evade the incoming weapon, whilst the other turns to ram the U-boat, forcing it to make a crash dive. Half an hour later, when it comes back up to take another look around, the U-boat commander spots part of the Second Battlecruiser squadron proceeding southeast, and reports these sightings. U-66 was one of the vessels that had been forced off station by earlier British patrols. Now, as it forges through the mists, they're startled when the armoured cruiser Duke of Edinburgh comes barrelling out of the mist, followed by a light cruiser and 8 battleships, forcing another crash dive. The somewhat bewildered U-boat nonetheless works its way into a firing position, but is then almost run over by a destroyer accompanying the capital ships and has to dive again. And by the time it's able to come back up to periscope depth at around 0635, it reports that the formation is heading north. Critically, this early information gives the High Seas Fleet a misleading picture that plays into what they were hoping for, as it seems that the Battlecruiser fleet is heading towards them, whilst the Grand Fleet is heading away from them, exactly what Scheer was hoping for. In actual fact, both fleet elements were simply undertaking a zigzag course to evade U-boats, and in both cases, the submarines had simply found the ships on one leg or the other of their respective zigzag courses. Whilst this allowed the Grand Fleet to head out to sea without suffering any damage from submarine ambush, back at home, the first of a number of signal intelligence errors were being made. Admiral Scheer was known to use the call sign DK, and so an officer asked the Signals Intel Department in room 40 to tell him where DK was. The reply was Wilhelmshaven, and thus Jellicoe was told that the High Seas Fleet was in port, and thus it would only be First Scouting Group to deal with. Room 40 knew that Scheer would use a different call sign when he left port, and if they'd been asked where Scheer was, they would have been able to tell the officer that Scheer was at sea. But that question wasn't asked, and the somewhat unpopular and arrogant officer had asked an out-of-context question for call sign DK, and so he received a practically useless, if technically correct, reply. First Scouting Group clears the last of the defensive minefields and heads northwest. The High Seas Fleet just over 2 hours steaming behind them. Both formations were in line ahead for this part of the passage, with scouting cruisers arced out ahead of them. Zeppelins are preparing to deploy, but the fog and low cloud is going to significantly limit their ability to see anything. Nothing much further of note happens for the rest of the morning and early afternoon as the various forces head for their initial target areas. Admiral Scheer has at this point received at least 3 separate reports citing small units of cruisers and battleships in different places and on different courses. He concluded,
"These reports give no enlightenment as to the enemy's purpose, but the varied forces of the separate divisions of the fleet and their diverging courses did not seem to suggest either combined action of an advance on the German Bight or any connection with our enterprise, but show the possibility that our hope of meeting with separate enemy divisions was likely to be fulfilled. We were, therefore, all the more determined to keep to our plan."
The Battlecruiser fleet is heading east. The First Scouting Group and High Seas Fleet are heading north, whilst the Grand Fleet is heading roughly southeast. At their current headings, the Battlecruiser fleet would cut through the aft of the First Scouting Group and the north of the High Seas Fleet, trapping itself between the two German formations in a manner that would be beyond Scheer and Hipper's wildest dreams. However, the Battlecruiser fleet had orders to turn north to meet the Grand Fleet once they hit a line 260 miles east of the British coast, and as they now reach this marker, they swing away from the unknown trap ahead of them. The Danish steamer N.J. Fjord has been happily sailing along for most of the day, but has recently come to a halt to blow off excess steam. Elements of Beatty's screen spot a column of vapour and move to investigate. Meanwhile, further east, destroyers of the First Scouting Group also spot the unusual sight, and they move to take a look as well. The British vessels spot the incoming Germans and signal that enemy ships have been spotted southeast of their position. HMS Galatia and HMS Phaeton open fire on the German torpedo boats, which fall back towards a formation of German light cruisers that are coming in to support them. Beatty orders the Battlecruiser fleet to swing southeast to cut off the German formation that he knows is out there. Jellicoe would later reflect that
there was now an excellent opportunity to concentrate his forces. The enemy was streaking towards our battle fleet, so that the loss of 2 or 3 miles by the battlecruisers was immaterial, but the opportunity was not taken.
Instead, in a foreshadowing of things to come, his first orders are not received by 5th Battle Squadron, which has been allowed to drift too far away to see his flags. and HMS Tiger at the back of Beatty's squadron, which had been ordered to retransmit any flag orders by signal light, had been taken to a position even further away from the 5th Battle Squadron than Lion herself by the course change. Combined with the fact that the Battlecruiser fleet was still scattered in individual squadrons, this missed signal left 5th Battle Squadron trailing 10 miles behind the Lion, reducing the Battlecruiser fleet advantages in numbers from 2-1 to 6-5, of which one is the relatively new and untested HMS Tiger, and the two others are older Indefatigable class battlecruisers whose speed and protection are noticeably inferior to almost every other capital ship present. Even worse, the maximum broadside weight of the remaining ships in Beatty's vicinity is now 58,400 pounds down from a combined total of 120,416 pounds, a reduction of just over 50%. This reduction of broadside weight means that the advantage against the Germans' 34,268 pound broadside has gone from a crushing 3.5-1 to a somewhat less imposing 1.7-1, and even that is optimistic, as Indefatigable and New Zealand are unlikely to manage 8-gun salvos except at the best of bearings, whereas the 11-inch armed German battlecruisers are generally speaking better laid out for cross-deck firing. Admiral Evan Thomas, in charge of 5th Battle Squadron, would later state,
"The only way I could account for no signal having been received by me was that the Vice-Admiral was going to signal another course to the 5th Battle Squadron, possibly to get the enemy light cruisers between us. Anyway, if he wished us to turn, the searchlight would have done it in a moment. It was not until the Tiger asked Lion by wireless whether the signal to turn was to be made to the Barham that the Vice-Admiral seemed to realise the situation."
Action stations were now being sounded by bugle across the ships of the battlecruiser fleet, and last-minute preparations were being made for action. Aboard Barham, the captain of Marines in charge of X-turret realises that he's left a number of tins full of petrol in one of the ship's small boats, and quickly dashes off to throw them overboard. Aboard Warspite, the first officer, Commander Woolwyn, arrives at his action station in B-turret only to realise he's about to go into action in a 15-inch gun turret without any ear protection. Luckily, a helpful midshipman has plenty of cotton wool stashed away in a pocket and lends him some. Aboard HMS New Zealand, Captain John Green, also known as Jimmy, solemnly orders the Maori warrior skirt and green pendant be brought to the bridge, where he puts them on, thus enabling the supernatural protection that these items bestow upon his ship. First shot has gone to the British, but first hit goes to the Germans as SMS Elbing of 2nd Scouting Group hits the Galatia at nearly the maximum range of its guns. HMS Engadine launches a seaplane carrier for recon, the first carrier launch in direct naval combat history. So let's hear a bit about what happened then.
HMS Engadine, on the other hand, sailed with the battlecruiser force under command of Vice Admiral Beatty. She was smaller than Campania, but slightly faster, and only recently been modified to protect its aircraft with a proper hangar structure. Engadine carried 4 aircraft, 2 short 184 recon bombers, and with 2 additional Sopwith baby scouts. It was then this ship that would add an air dimension to the battle. When the German fleet was spotted on the 31st of May, Vice Admiral Beatty informed Engadine to send up a scout to get a better look at the German force. Now, Engadine's captain did not do so without protest, for the waves and haze made a launch rather difficult, and a recovery of the plane later on questionable. There was no stopping Beatty though, so Engadine came to a halt, winched a short 184 over the side, and wished the pilot and his crewmen good luck. With Flight Commander Frederick Jutland at the controls and George Trevin acting as observer, the short took off just after 3 p.m.
Elements of the Grand Fleet begin to pick up increasing wireless traffic, courtesy of the German habit of broadcasting everything at maximum power. Jellicoe orders the Grand Fleet to prepare for action. Teacups and mugs are stowed, and a young Prince Albert, the future King George VI, takes his station aboard HMS Collingwood. although the process is initially slowed by the sounding of general quarters instead of action stations, but everyone gets the idea pretty soon, and flags begin to flutter out. To aid in spotting and target identification in the murk, ships tend to fly more than one battle ensign, and soon dozens of flags, from small pennants to huge battle flags that could double as a smaller ship's sail, are streaming from every ship for miles around. A midshipman aboard HMS Neptune notes,
"Several ships were flying, instead of the customary one white ensign, 3 or 4 ensigns from various parts of the rigging. In about 10 minutes the air seemed to be thick with white ensigns, large and small, silk and bunting, hoisted wherever halyards could be found."
Off to one side, HMS Blanche, a cruiser acting independent of any specific squadron, also added 4 Union Jacks, one from each of her 4 funnels. Scattered throughout the fleet are a number of officers who were not especially well known at this point, but would later lead elements of the Royal Navy in the next World War. Percy Noble, Charles Ramsay, John Tovey, Philip Vian, Dudley Pound, and a number of others are all present, either in command of various destroyers and battleships, or else as lesser ranks aboard the same vessels. Aboard HMS Marlborough, Lieutenant Boyer Smith, in charge of Y Turret, records,
"The first hint we had that something might materialize this time was a message to the effect that a squadron of enemy light cruisers had been sighted some 40 miles ahead. A smile stole round the gun's crews as I passed this on, and a smile of mingled sympathy and grim satisfaction, for a squadron of light cruisers running up against the Grand Fleet will probably not remain long afloat."
Density of fog and prevailing light conditions give the Germans the upper hand as far as spotting goes for the moment, and at a range of about 15 miles, the first scouting group spots the leading elements of the Battlecruiser fleet heading their way. Gamely forging on through the low cloud and mist, Engadin's aircraft is about to come into contact.
Staying below 1,000 feet due to clouds and haze, after about 30 minutes, Jutland managed to spot a line of German light cruisers and destroyers heading northwest. Dutifully, he radioed his discovery back to Agthe. On the more problematic side, he himself had been spotted, and German AA guns opened up. With little practice in shooting at aircraft on the German side, Jutland was in comparatively little danger, as most shells missed their mark, but some did get close. While Jutland did his best to get out as much of the short as she would give, which wasn't much seeing that the top speed lay well below 100 miles per hour, Trevin informed Agthe on the German line. There, the captain was in a dilemma. Either break radio silence, warn Beatty, but also give the Germans a chance to locate a British fleet by following the signal bearings, or try to send over a message the old-fashioned way, via signal lamp. In the end, standing orders were obeyed and the lamp was used, only for the light signals to be missed by the flagship. In the meantime, Jutland's short plane ran out of fuel, as a fuel line had snapped. Setting her down in the sea somewhere between the Germans and the approaching British battle line, Jutland was out of the fight. While radio signals were sent to Agthe in the hopes of getting picked up, Jutland tried to get the attention of a passing British cruiser via the clever use of semaphore, explaining his own predicament and the locations of the Germans. The ploy failed, but Agthe was able to hone in on the short aircraft, picking up Jutland, now Rutland of Jutland, his crew member, and the aircraft. It was the first time in history that an aircraft had been used in locating and signaling the location of an enemy fleet, albeit that this contribution ran somewhat short of an ideal outcome. Naval aviation played no further part in the battle.
However, the Battlecruiser fleet now spots First Scouting Group directly, and both sides now have their guns trained and watch the range calculations tick down towards a practical firing distance. Beatty's ships, still trying to sort themselves into a line of battle from their 2 independent squadrons and completely missing the 5th Battle Squadron, are now entering the range of the heavy 13.5-inch guns that equip Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary and Tiger. But due to a series of errors, including a catastrophic overestimation of the range aboard the Lion, the Battlecruiser fleet does not open fire. The minutes instead tick by quietly, and almost a quarter of an hour where the British ships could have been pounding Hipper's forces without reply pass completely without incident. Mindful of his duty, Hipper orders the first scouting group to head southeast towards the High Seas Fleet, which is about 2 hours steaming behind them, but less than an hour away if both elements of the German fleet head towards each other at top speed. The British ships are still making final course adjustments when the range ticks down far enough for the German ships to open fire, and Hipper's guns send the first big gun salvo of the battle downrange. Thus begins the run to the south, with the Lützow, Derflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke and von der Tann ranged against the Lion, Queen Mary, Princess Royal, Tiger, Indefatigable and New Zealand. Hipper recorded,
"The fact that the English battlecruisers, probably on account of bad light conditions or perhaps forming their line of battle too late, delayed opening fire, allowing us to withhold our fire until the enemy was in effective gun range. The possibility of obtaining a rapid gunnery superiority is principally to be attributed to this delay in opening fire, which compelled the enemy to remain a longer time within effective gun range."
The British are surprised, believing their longer-range guns are still out of range, and so for the first few salvos, every ship except Princess Royal sends their shells far, far over their targets, thinking that they're still at extreme range. Only Princess Royal and Lion are on a steady course, which further impedes the firing of the other battlecruisers as their own bearing is constantly changing, and early fire control equipment isn't really set up to deal with that. Lighting and visibility due to gun smoke are also against the British. But this is overshadowed by much larger problems. The standing orders call for each British ship to engage its opposite number, except the flagship Lion, which would add its fire to that directed against the German flagship Lützow. But, thanks to a second major error in signalling, Lion and Princess Royal engage Lützow, but Queen Mary engages Seydlitz instead of Derflinger. Tiger then engages New Zealand's target, SMS Moltke, whilst Indefatigable engages von der Tann. This leaves the bemused Derflinger unengaged and able to fire away with practice condition gunnery, which it focuses first upon Lion. Aboard Derflinger, Chief Gunnery Officer, Korvettenkapitän Georg von Hasse recalls,
"What astonished me was that so far we had apparently not been hit once. Only quite rarely did a shot stray near us. I observed the gun turrets of our target more closely and established that the ship was not firing at us. She too was firing at our flagship. I observed the enemy ship for a moment. By some mistake we were being left out. I laughed grimly and then began to engage our enemy with complete calm, as at gun practice, and with continually increasing accuracy."
With the advantage of a stable course, a better idea of the actual range, and superior visibility, the German guns have by far the better of this part of the engagement. HMS Tiger receives multiple hits from Moltke, despite the latter being attacked by 2 ships at once. Beatty sends a series of signals back to the Grand Fleet, saying that he'd seen enemy battlecruisers, that they were running southeast towards home, and finally that he was engaging them. Notably lacking from any of this was any position information. A 12-inch shell from Lützow smashes into the amidships Q turret of HMS Lion. The hit is described thus by one of the crew.
No further confirmation was necessary. The armoured roof of the Q turret had been folded back like an open sardine tin. Thick yellow smoke was rolling up in the clouds from the gaping hole, and the guns were cocked up in the air awkwardly. All this happened within a few yards of where Beatty was standing, and none of us on the bridge had heard the detonation. The destructive power was enormous, but oddly, in the maelstrom of the battles, completely unregistered on the bridge.
HMS Nicator, a destroyer of the 13th Flotilla, is stuck with its fellows between the opposing battle lines. Leading torpedoman Thorn noted,
"The noise was deafening, and being between the 2 fleets we soon felt the heavy shells passing uncomfortably close overhead, even seeing some turn lengthwise over and over, expecting every moment to be hit and blown to bits, I perched on the foremost torpedo tube, taking a very dim view of events.
The smoke from the destroyers confounds the gunnery on both sides somewhat, the Germans concluding the positioning of the British light craft must be deliberate. The weather is somewhat in the Germans' favour, both in general lighting and in the form of a general west to east breeze that blows gun and funnel smoke into the view of the British rangefinders from their own ships, whilst also clearing the German gun and funnel smoke from first scouting group's rangefinders. HMS Indefatigable takes 2, possibly 3 hits aft from the same salvo, courtesy of SMS von der Tann. She shears out of line as her aft turret burns, and moments later the magazine explodes, albeit it's not 100% clear if the fatal hit was directly to the turret or straight through the 4-inch armour and into the magazine. Whether it's a progressive explosion or largely vented through holes in the ship, Indefatigable doesn't actually die immediately, but is sinking slowly by the stern, with the ship's hull severed completely from X-turret aft. However, another salvo screams in, and 2 hits are registered forward, one of which sets off a chain reaction that sees the forward magazine detonate instantly in a colossal explosion that sends huge pieces of the ship whirling away in all directions, as well as instantly wiping out all but 3 crew from those who remain following the first detonation. She'd sailed into action with 1,019 men aboard. Of the survivors, leading signalman Falmer recounts,
"A message came through that the flags were entangled around the mast. Some boy must go up, so I took my sea boots off, climbed up the port top, went up the Jacob's ladder right to the very top. I unfolded the flag and I sat on the wireless yard. Looking around, I could see all the German fleet, and I made up about 40 ships. There were 6 of us, and I suppose we'd been out in action about an hour and a half or so, when a shell or something hit the magazines. There was a terrific explosion. The guns went up in the air, just like matchsticks. 12-inch guns they were. And she began to settle down. Within half a minute or so, she was gone. I was thrown, I suppose, well, I was about 180 foot up, you understand, and I was thrown well clear of the ship, otherwise I would have been sucked under."
Falmer would later find able seaman Elliot and the ship's badly wounded captain, Charles Sobery, alive in the water, but Sobery died of his wounds before a German destroyer happened to find them. The rest of the British line appears to lose formation as reports of torpedo tracks cause the ships to undertake evasive action that further throws out the calculations of the fire control computers and requires them to be reset with new data. Far to the north, learning of the unfolding action, Jellicoe orders 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron to increase to full speed and drive south to assist Beatty. Admiral Hood, aboard HMS Invincible, accompanied by HMS Inflexible and HMS Indomitable, the oldest battlecruisers in the fleet, and indeed in the world, now plunge south to try and assist, whilst the Grand Fleet accelerates to 20 knots. Aboard HMS Lion, the surviving turret crew and some of the other nearby sailors were clearing up some of the wreckage and fires that were in and around Q turret when a shell and charge in the breech block of one of the guns falls out, and the unburnt cordite charges ignite, blowing many off their feet, with the fireball travelling down the loading cages and into the handling room, making a beeline for the magazine. But even as the fireball races both skywards and downwards, the mortally wounded Major Francis Harvey, Royal Marines, crawls over to a voice pipe despite the loss of both legs and orders the magazines locked down and flooded. It's his last act on this earth. His body will be found later next to the voice pipe, but it saves the ship and the 1,300 plus men still aboard her. For this action, he will receive a posthumous Victoria Cross. Aboard HMS Warspite, Commander Walwyn is keeping a close eye out when something bears out of the murk.
Sighted 4 columns of smoke in the mist and gave orders to load. Commenced firing on what seemed to be 4 light cruisers. Could not see well from B turret lookout hood. Blast from A turret struck me as worse than usual. Number 2 light cruiser, suddenly obscured by massive smoke and flame, turned to starboard and engaged battlecruisers on port bow. Could hardly see anything to lay on, spotting very bad. Time of flight watchkeeper was first rate and could nearly always identify splashes where they came down. Saw several salvos splash just short of us. Tried to see next ahead Valiant, but could not see her through the slit, only just caught her wake through the corner of my eye.
The light cruisers rapidly turn into the rest of First Scouting Group, and the pendulum begins to swing as huge columns of water erupt close by the German battlecruisers. Unheralded by either side, the racing ships of 5th Battle Squadron have finally caught up. In contrast to the scattered shooting of the battlecruisers, the Scapper-trained gunners aboard Valiant, Warspite, Malaya and Barham actually have the opposite problem. The German crews observe a fall of shot with groupings that are so tight that salvos are landing less than a ship's length away, but without any shells hitting. Ironically, a slightly wider spread, more in line with normal gunnery standards, would probably have scored hits almost from the first salvo. Nonetheless, within 60 seconds of opening fire, a 15-inch shell from HMS Barham slams into SMS von der Tann, hitting the belt armour just below the waterline. Although the shell explodes before penetrating, the sheer force of the impact and detonation buckles the almost 10-inch thick steel plate, rupturing the hull and allowing 600 tons of water to flood in. The shockwave also disabled the steering gear, and the German battlecruiser falls out of line to port. Only frantic work below decks restores the steering in time to prevent von der Tann looping back on itself straight into the guns of the entire 5th Battle Squadron. A crewman aboard von der Tann recalls that
"The hit made the hull vibrate like a tuning fork. 5 or 6 times the ship's end swayed back and forth, and the bending of the ship damaged the radio antenna between the masts."
over the course of the next few minutes, the rest of the Queen Elizabeths draw into range and begin to open fire. Admiral Scheer recorded,
"This made the situation critical for our cruisers. The new enemy fired with extraordinary rapidity and accuracy, with greater ease as regards the latter, as he met with almost no opposition, as our battlecruisers were fully engaged with Admiral Beatty's ships."
HMS Queen Mary is performing the best of all the British battlecruisers, with a steady, rapid and accurate series of salvos aimed at SMS Seydlitz, and she'd already scored 3 hits, destroying Seydlitz's rear turret, starting a number of small fires, and knocking out part of the secondary battery, taking 2 hits in return to little immediate effect. However, with the Lion being lost to sight after the battering inflicted on it by Lutzow, the Derflinger had switched targets, and both it and Seydlitz are now firing at Queen Mary. 3 shells from the Iron Dog and 2 from Seydlitz hit within moments of each other, and almost immediately thereafter the forward magazines detonate, blowing the ship in 2 under the bridge. What's left of the midships and aft section begins to roll over and sink practically immediately, with further explosions sounding from inside the hull. HMS Tiger, following, is forced to take emergency evasive action to avoid the wreck, which takes 1,266 men with her and leaves fewer than a dozen struggling in the water. Commander von Hasse, the first gunnery officer aboard Derflinger, describes what he sees thus.
"A vivid red flame shot up from her forepart. Then came an explosion forward, followed by a much heavier explosion amidships. Immediately afterwards, she blew up with a terrific explosion, the masts collapsing inwards and the smoke hiding everything."
2 of the survivors gave a more detailed account. The first explosion shook the ship, and those in X turret noted the hydraulic gauges that monitored the turret's training mechanisms dropped suddenly. Another explosion threw 2 men under one of the guns, which then fell off its mountings and crushed them, even as the force of the explosion buckled the floor upwards. Deciding that their turret was done, the remaining crew opened the hatches to help man the 4-inch secondary battery, only to find the aft 4-inch guns turned into shrapnel and the whole ship listing badly to port. Realising this, Lieutenant Ewart, in charge of the turret, went back inside to tell the men in the working chamber, magazines and shell room to get out. Men began to fall down the deck and into the water, and Petty Officer Francis, who managed to climb the starboard rail, crawled over the edge and down the hull into the water. Last out of the turret was Midshipman Owen, who was by now able to stand on the back of the turret, noting the red-hot stern with hull plates missing and glowing frame girders. The bow then erupted in one massive explosion, shaking the ship and throwing him off into the sea. Despite having opened a fair distance between himself and the ship, Petty Officer Francis found himself sucked back and under as the ship went down, managing to fight his way back to the surface with the aid of a hammock he encountered that was heading upwards, which along with some wood managed to keep him afloat until a destroyer eventually found him. Midshipman Owen was still recovering his senses in the water, which gave him an unusual waterline perspective as
the 5th Battle Squadron steamed past in a perfect order, firing continuously. The enemy's shells were falling a good deal short of the squadron, but one of them must have exploded in the water close to me, causing me to lose consciousness. I have no more recollection of what happened until I found myself on the forecastle of the Laurel.
The fog of war surrounding these events is evident in Admiral Scheer's account written just after the war.
Whether the destruction was the result of artillery action or was caused by torpedo from the battlecruisers or by torpedo from the torpedo boat Flotilla 9 can never be ascertained for certain, but most probably was due to artillery action which caused an explosion of ammunition or oil aboard the enemy vessel.
There was also considerable confusion in the German fleet as to whether 5th Battle Squadron was made up of 4 or 5 ships, with Scheer giving the opinion even in 1919 that there must have been 5 based on the number of reports that he'd received in battle to this effect. Another German salvo either hits HMS Princess Royal or lands very close, and the ship vanishes amidst the spray, smoke and fragments. Aboard HMS Lion, a crewman reports that she too has blown up. This report prompts Beatty to remark to his flag captain,
"Chatfield, there seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today."
Ironically enough, Princess Royal is in fact very much alive, powering out of the smoke and spray a few moments later. Major Harvey's last act proves providential again as the heat and embers from the fire in what is left of Lion's Q turret ignite multiple further charges stored in the working chamber, the flash racing down into the ship, but finding only sealed doors and seawater, thus saving the ship from the same fate as her half-sister Queen Mary, fragments of whom are still falling from the sky. The leading ships of the High Seas Fleet sight the funnel and gun smoke of the battlecruiser action, and shortly thereafter, the Second Light Cruiser Squadron, screening ahead of Beatty's force, spots the High Seas Fleet, dodging madly to avoid the torrent of heavy caliber fire sent their way in an effort to ascertain exactly what it is they've spotted and report back the enemy strength. Aboard Southampton, the encounter is remembered thus.
"We saw ahead of us first smoke, then masts, then ships. 16 battleships with destroyers around them on each bow. We hung on a few minutes to make sure before confirming the message. Then my commander, efficient and cool, said, 'If you're going to make that signal, you had better make it now, sir. You may never make another.'"
The cruiser wheeled about, reporting the 16 dreadnoughts and 6 pre-dreadnoughts heading towards the battlecruiser fleet. The battle line consisting of SMS König, Grosser Kurfürst, Kronprinz, Markgraf, Kaiser, Prinz Regent Leopold, Kaiserin, Friedrich der Große, Ostfriesland, Thüringen, Helgoland, Oldenburg, Posen, Rhineland, Nassau, Westfalen, Deutschland, Hessen, Pommern, Hanover, Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein. In both the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet, the flagship is positioned more towards the centre of the formation. Admiral Scheer explains why this is.
When there is a question of leading several squadrons, it is not advisable to take up a position at the head of the enemy line, as it is not possible from there to watch the direction in which the fight develops. Being bound to any such a position might lead to the commander-in-chief finding himself at the rear instead of at the head of the assembled line. During the whole time that fighting was going on, I had a clear lookout over the whole line and was able to signal with great rapidity in both directions. As the fighting line of warships was more than 10 kilometers long, I should not have been able to overlook my entire line from the wing.
Thanks to the previously mentioned miscommunications ashore with Room 40, this is the first news that the Royal Navy at sea has that the High Seas Fleet is at sea. As 15 minutes after the first funnel smoke is spotted, Jellicoe receives the following from Southampton.
Urgent. Priority. Course of enemy's battle fleets. North, single line ahead. Composition of van, Kaiser class. Bearing, off center, east. Destroyers on both wings and ahead. Enemy's battlecruisers joining battle fleet from northward. My position, latitude 0.56 degrees 29 minutes north. Longitude 6 degrees 14 minutes east.
Torpedoman Thorn aboard HMS Nicator records,
We saw ahead the German destroyers coming to attack our battlecruisers. Commander Bingham of the Nestor never deviated, but led us straight at the enemy destroyers who broke away as we charged through. Their formations were so dislocated that their attack on our battlecruisers never materialised. Some reversed course to pursue us, but our speed put us ahead. Nomad was hit in the engine room by a large shell which brought her to a dead stop. Both Nestor and Agthe fired two 21-inch torpedoes each, but before anyone could see if they hit, we had swung round to rejoin the battlecruisers, now some 10 miles distant.
Practically every available destroyer in the two battlecruiser forces' screens is now engaged in a boiling pell-mell battle between the two capital ship firing lines, with torpedoes thick in the water from multiple launches. Both sides' battlecruisers break away from the incoming weapons, evading them all with the exception of Seydlitz, which will catch a torpedo from HMS Petard at 16:57. Although the ship manages to not slow down from the hit, it is still taking on water. It's a relatively good day for the Petard, which also hits V-29, sinking it. Other destroyers managed to cripple V-27, which is abandoned and sunk by its own side. The overall light forces engagement therefore ends in favour of the British, but HMS Nestor and HMS Nomad are left immobilised, albeit still afloat. That state of affairs won't last, however, since the High Seas Fleet is bearing down on the position and will shortly finish off both small vessels. Deep in the bowels of Seydlitz, oft-forgotten heroics are being undertaken.
The stokers and coalstormers deserves the highest praise, for they had to wield their shovels mostly in the dark, often up to their knees in water without knowing where it had come from and how much it would rise. Unfortunately, we had very bad coal that formed so much slag that the fires had to be cleaned after half the usual time, and the grates burned through and fell into the ash pits. The spare ones had to be altered in the thick of the battle, because even the beams supporting the grates were bent by the heat.
Elsewhere on the ship, Seydlitz's helmsman, previously demoted for habitual drunkenness, is carefully steering the ship as best he can. He'll end up being at this post for 24 hours straight without relief, becoming the only non-officer in the High Seas Fleet to receive the Iron Cross First Class for his efforts in the battle both now and later on as pretty much the saviour of the ship. At a range of about 12 miles, Beatty spots the incoming German battleships and orders a full 180-degree turn, back towards the Grand Fleet. Even at full strength, the battlecruiser fleet is not capable of engaging such a force, and still less after the loss of Indefatigable and Queen Mary. Unfortunately, more poor signalling means that the 5th Battle Squadron, still sailing hard south, don't see any signal and come pounding past the bemused battlecruisers and straight at 5 times their number of enemy battleships. As Commander Woolwyn aboard Warspite records,
Suddenly saw our battlecruisers coming the opposite way and felt rather anxious to know what was up.
At this stage of the fighting, the first scouting group has landed about 42 hits on the battlecruiser fleet in 5th Battle Squadron, with the battlecruiser fleet scoring a mere 11 hits in return. 5th Battle Squadron, despite their late arrival and short engagement period, have already managed 6 hits on first scouting group and plan on adding a lot more. Further north, Jellicoe has received the Second Light Cruiser Squadron's signal, as well as Beatty's notice of his reversal of course. He signals the entire Grand Fleet that fleet action is imminent and orders the fleet to action stations. But he faces one major decision. The fleet is still in columns, good for cruising, terrible for fighting. He can order them to form a battle line by turning to port or starboard, but one choice will lead him to cross the enemy T, a perfect position. The other will at best result in a passing engagement, at worst leave his rearmost ships exposed to most of the High Seas Fleet's gunnery. It all depends on if the Germans are chasing Beatty on his port or starboard quarter, as well as Beatty's own location, heading and speed. Beatty, of course, is not telling Jellicoe anything in this regard, leaving his superior to make an educated guess. At maximum range, the High Seas Fleet's leading units open fire on the Battlecruiser fleet. Making the worst of an already bad situation, as the Queen Elizabeths come thundering past, Beatty orders them to turn in succession, meaning the lead ship will turn and then each other ship will follow that same course as if they were all on a rail track, which means that with every ship that makes the turn, the High Seas Fleet will be closer and closer to that turning position, leaving successive ships ever more vulnerable, moving slowly and broadside on to the massed enemy guns. A much better order would be turn together, with each ship simultaneously turning, effectively flipping the line around in a quarter of the time. And on top of all of this, flag-signalled orders are only supposed to be carried out once the signal is acknowledged and the original signal is hauled down, the signal to execute. Bemused, Flag Officer Seymour watches the pride of the Grand Fleet steam headlong into the entire German Navy, but leaves the signals up, therefore technically refusing them permission to make even the less than adequate turn in succession. Further north, but closing, and satisfied that his ships are making themselves ready, Jellicoe informs the Admiralty in London that battle is about to be joined, whilst still agonising over which direction he should be turning his fleet. As the 5th Battle Squadron comes into the range of the High Seas Fleet, Admiral Evan Thomas, who so far has dutifully followed Beatty's orders, or lack of them, has finally had just about enough. He can see the danger plain as day as the High Seas Fleet's leading elements open up a barrage with every gun they possess. He therefore issues his own squadron orders to expect to have to make sudden course changes and to follow his lead, before ordering the wheel hard over and slewing Barham around. Valiant and Warspite move to follow, replicating the turn in succession order, whilst the trailing HMS Malaya sees the oncoming danger and prepares to turn as soon as it possibly can without crashing into Warspite. The 4 embattled ships give as good as they're getting, crashing out 15-inch broadsides at Shear's vessels, even as shells of every calibre the Germans possess pour into the sea around them, whilst others will soon inevitably begin to find their mark. Interestingly, Admiral Shear believes that this manoeuvre is a deliberate ploy by the British to cover the withdrawal of the Battlecruiser fleet. Having spent almost an hour steaming south, Admiral Hood aboard HMS Invincible signals Beatty asking for location, course, speed and heading so that 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron can assist. He receives no reply, and has to press on based entirely on guesswork and the rolling sound of gunfire from somewhere further south. Beatty, now deprived of 5th Battle Squadron again through his own actions, finds himself with 4 battlecruisers in various operational states, from the near-crippled Lion to the remarkably intact New Zealand, facing off against Hipper's 5 ships. So he orders the range opened to avoid further losses to his command, even as fire pours in from every working gun on Hipper's ships, battering Lion and Tiger still further. But this is of less than no help to 5th Battle Squadron, as Warspite and Malaya find themselves fighting the entire High Seas Fleet solo. Barham and Valiant are now under assault from Hipper's battlecruisers. For extra fun, Warspite is also targeted by Hipper, as well as Shear, giving it the dubious honour of having likely been at least a passing target for every single German capital ship to ever have range of it during the battle. 13 hits are distributed over 3 of 5th Battle Squadron's ships. Valiant comes out of it unscathed. Barham and Warspite at this stage are hit by the first scouting group, whilst Malaya takes 7 hits from the heavy guns of the High Seas Fleet, starting a dangerous fire on her starboard casemate passageways, knocking out the entire battery and causing heavy casualties. But, despite the odds, the 5th Battle Squadron gives back better than they get, dealing out 13 hits in return to 1st Scouting Group's Battlecruisers and another 5 to the High Seas Fleet's battleships, the 4 ships engaging a total of 9 separate enemy targets between them at this time. Lieutenant Brind is in charge of Malaya's B turret.
The enemy continued to fire rapidly at us during and after turn, but did not really get near us until after 5:15 p.m. When their salvos began to arrive thick and fast, from my position in the turret, I could see them falling just short, and just over several times, and a great column of black water fall on top of the turret. I was trying to make out our target, but expected at any moment we would get a nasty knock, and that if any of these shells falling all around us should hit us in the right place, our speed would be sadly reduced, and we should not stand a very good chance. The salvos were coming in at a rate of about 6 to 9 per minute. At 5:20 p.m. I saw a large column of water rise between my guns and felt the turret shake heavily. We had been hit abreast the turret, below the water line. So heavy was the shock that I feared that our fighting efficiency had been gravely impaired. Not so much that a shell had pierced any part of the turret, but that the shock of the impact had seriously damaged our loading arrangements. I went into the gun house to inquire whether all was well below, and received a report that they had been somewhat shaken by the blow, but that everything seemed all right. This proved too optimistic, because when the main cage arrived in the working chamber, it was found that shell could not be withdrawn, and there was a proper jam-up. I dashed down, and we had to work like anything to clear it. After what seemed an age, but could not have been very long, we succeeded and managed to get to the cage back into the working order. During this time, the secondary method of loading was in use for the right gun, and although 5 rounds had been loaded in this way, the turret never missed the chance to fire. I found everyone very cheery and full of go. They had no thought that we should come off worse than the enemy, but wanted to know how many German ships were left afloat, requiring to be finished off. Until about 5:40 p.m, the enemy's fire continued to be very brisk and fell all around us. The visibility had been getting steadily worse, and we had very rarely been able to see anything but the flashes of the German guns. During this time we were several times hit, to what extent I could not tell, but we had a bad list to starboard.
Warspite was being even more roughly handled, Commander Walwyn noting,
Very soon after the turn could see leading ships of the High Seas Fleet, hardly discernible but counted 6 or 8. Long lines of orange flame seemed to ripple along continuously and realised they were firing at us. Felt heavy shakes, but didn't think much of it. Blast of A turret blew water into my eyes and it was very uncomfortable in the hood. Then received a message from the captain to leave the turret and go aft at once to see what the matter was, as we'd been badly hit. Called Coates and told him to take charge, that all was well and we were in primary control. Thought for half a minute, should I go out over the upper deck or down through the shell room? Decided I ought to go over. Midshipman Grenfell at that moment opened the door and bowed to me, which decided me, and I jumped out telling Walken to go down through the trunk the other way and meet me on the mess deck. Out of the turret, in a bit of a funk, and ran. A turret fired as I was half down the ladder at the side of the turret, but I was on the lee side. Ran aft and down the port superstructure ladder, tried to get into the door, but all the clips were on, so I climbed over the second cutter. Shell came through the after funnel and spattered everywhere. Put my collar up and ran like a stag down through the door to the battery deck. Marines in the compartment were all right, but they had the door half open, luckily for me. Told them to shut it at once. All piece below, went right aft along the mess deck port side, aft down by the spirit room door, through lobbies, saw nothing. Number 6 Fire Brigade patrols reported everything all right. Went forward again and met Walken grinning all over, sent him to the captain to say all was well below and nothing the matter as far as I could see. As a matter of fact, we had been holed in the side by direct hit below the waterline, which flooded capstan engine flat, but of this could see nothing. Crossed Cook's lobby to port side and was just going forward to the forecastle deck when 12-inch came in through the starboard side and burst with a terrific sheet of flame. Impenetrable dust, smoke, stink and everything. Seemed to fall from everywhere at once. Called for number 2 fire brigade and several rushed out and we got fire out fairly easily. The place was full of smoke and several men were sick. Awful stench. Went aft to port side again and right aft to lobbies, found water pouring through Admiral's doorway. Was told we'd been badly hit aft and water was then 12 inches deep.
One of the engineers aboard HMS Falmouth, part of the 3rd Light Cruiser Squadron and in turn part of the Battlecruiser Fleet screening force, popped his head out of a hatch to see the German fleet in pursuit and recorded that,
"I began to be a bit anxious about the engines, as I knew that if we broke down, we should very shortly have been in the centre of the High Seas Fleet, where we would have been in a similar position to the proverbial cotton-wool rabbit being chased through Hades by an asbestos terrier."
Along with the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, Rear Admiral Arbuthnot's 1st Cruiser Squadron, made up of older armoured cruisers forming the leading screen for the Grand Fleet, are now entering the combat arena. One of its ships, HMS Black Prince, sights 3rd Light Cruiser Squadron, Beatty's forward screen, as it heads towards them. This visual sighting is the first concrete information that the Grand Fleet has received about the position and heading of the Battlecruiser fleet. With the haze working against him and a surge of British light cruisers and destroyers heading towards him, Hipper breaks off the action.
"I had to work against a blinding sunset in the western sky and devastating enemy artillery. The sun stood deep and the horizon was hazy and I had to fire directly into the sun. I saw absolutely nothing of the enemy, who was behind a dense cloud of smoke. The gunnery officers could find no target, although we made a superb one ourselves. There was nothing else to do but to take the ships out of the battle for a while."
This would also give First Scouting Group some time to repair the damage that 5th Battle Squadron had dished out, as well as get some disabled guns working again. HMS Chester, part of 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron's screen, runs into the 4 light cruisers of the 2nd Scouting Group, which are screening Hipper's 1st Scouting Group on their own way north. Outnumbered 4-1, Chester is hammered by the German ships and frantically attempts to signal for help, fire back, manoeuvre, and evade, all at the same time. 2 minutes later, Admiral Hood notices gunfire coming from Chester's last known heading and alters course to intercept. In the murk, some of the larger British cruisers are mistaken by the German ships for considerably nastier units, with Scheer being informed that HMS Agincourt is, for some reason, operating with the light cruisers. With the remaining ships of the Battlecruiser fleet having joined up with the 5th Battle Squadron again, Beatty's command once more holds a numerical advantage and a considerable firepower advantage. With the light and relative positions having shifted, they also enjoy much better visual conditions with their targets highlighted and themselves obscured. Thus, they re-engage First Scouting Group. Hipper realises that with several ships damaged and the heavy accurate fire of most of 5th Battle Squadron zeroing in, he has a little chance of accomplishing much more and turns back towards the High Seas Fleet. At about the same time, HMS Lion is spotted from HMS Iron Duke. Jellicoe and Beatty are now in visual range, and the Grand Fleet's Admiral continues to demand reports from Beatty as to the location of the German fleet. They must be close, as Beatty is firing at something, and Jellicoe can see Beatty. The time left to deploy the Grand Fleet is fast running out. Beatty doesn't reply even as the cruisers and battleships of Jellicoe's own forces, arrayed on his starboard flank, which is slightly ahead of his own ship in the centre, begin to relay their own reports of German ships being sighted, albeit that these reports are sporadic and somewhat self-contradictory. In a slightly lighter moment, the paymaster of HMS New Zealand heads up on deck for some fresh air, unaware of the recommencement of action. He stretches, takes a deep breath, and suddenly has his trousers blown off by P-turret firing across the deck. Suitably embarrassed, he beats a hasty retreat. 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron looms up out of the murk and the tables are now turned on 2nd Scouting Group. The time in Scapa has been well spent, and within 3 minutes Invincible's guns have crippled the light cruiser SMS Wiesbaden and forced the rest of 2nd Scouting Group to break off, saving the Chester. Wiesbaden, largely crippled, nevertheless refuses to sink for the moment and will become something of a steel piñata for passing British capital ships over the next few hours, whilst throwing the odd torpedo back in retaliation. Second Scouting Group assumes that 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron is the vanguard of the Grand Fleet and turns back towards 1st Scouting Group and the High Seas Fleet in order to lead them onto the big German guns. 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron's destroyers fight a savage action with 1st and 2nd Scouting Group's torpedo boats amidst the drifting mist and smoke clouds, with the 3 old battlecruisers dodging and weaving through a number of waves of German torpedoes in a display of excellent ship handling. During this, the destroyer HMS Shark is disabled in much the same way as Wiesbaden, and like the German ship will keep up sporadic fire against random German targets until it eventually sinks. Beatty finally responds to the repeated signals from his superior officer, although still without any course or speed data. And Jellicoe, whilst he has been pondering the single biggest decision for his career for quite some time, now has about 60 seconds to decide the fate of an entire empire. The pressure is huge, doubly so without the proper scouting information from the battlecruiser fleet, as on this decision could rest the fate of the war, and indeed the fate of Britain itself. Get it wrong, and at best the Grand Fleet would go off in the wrong direction, leaving only damaged battleships and exploded battlecruisers to show for the battlecruiser fleet's efforts. At worst, he could send the Grand Fleet into a trap from which only a few might escape. His forces were currently in cruising formation, with the various divisions of the different battle squadrons arranged in 6 columns, each consisting of 4 ships. He's keeping Admiral Sturdy, the victor of the Battle of the Falklands, but something of an unorthodox thinker, next to him in the heart of the formation, to prevent him from doing something unexpected. But to fight most effectively and utilise their full broadside firepower of the world's largest collection of capital ships, Jellicoe needs to change this into a battle line. He has a number of options to hand. He could order the fleet to deploy to port or to starboard, which would take them in completely opposite directions. He could form a single line and head south directly. He could even order the fleet to split up, either as they deployed or after they deployed. He could even, according to some tactics, deploy as one column, see what the enemy's doing, and then deploy the rear columns in a different direction to form a pincer movement. He knows Admiral Sturdy is greatly in favour of breaking off a portion of the Grand Fleet to form this pincer movement, and that's exactly why Sturdy is in the middle of the formation where he can't go anywhere without Jellicoe's authorisation. And of course there are numerous permutations on each of these major options, depending on exactly where Jellicoe believes the High Seas Fleet to be. As you can see, calculating the outcomes of all these options could not be done in a minute or so. But by 1815, Jellicoe had made his decision and was issuing his orders. The Grand Fleet would deploy to the east using a slight variation of the standard deployment patterns. The left-handmost division, headed by the battleship HMS King George V, will effectively stay on its southeast course, whilst the rest of the fleet's divisions will turn to port, forming up heading in a slightly northeasterly direction before turning around the point where King George V's division has passed and falling in behind said division, thus forming something of an arc. This would, according to what information he had as well as his own tactical intuition, allow him to cross Shears T whilst deploying every gun he commanded against a portion of the High Seas Fleet, the vanguard. Additionally, as the sun sank in the west, the Germans would be backlit and the British obscured in the mist and darkness. Exactly the same situation Admiral von Spee had inflicted on Admiral Cradock at the Battle of Coronel, only with the sides now reversed. If all went to plan, individual squadrons of German ships would be feeding themselves into the meat grinder of several hundred heavy guns with minimal ability to reply. Faced with this, Scheer could run, or he could die. The signal flags sang up their lines and acknowledgement signals rippled throughout the fleet. Then the flags rippled down, the signal to execute. Iron Duke let out 2 short blasts on its siren, and almost as one, the leading half-dozen battleships all slewed to port. sounding their horns as well, with the guns simultaneously training to starboard as the spotters atop the masts and sitting behind the lenses of rangefinders strained to spot the first sign of the High Seas Fleet. Behind them, in sequence, the Grand Fleet began to deploy. The High Seas Fleet, unknown to both sides, is only 7 miles away, and the British battle line itself is 6 miles long, even when sailing in close formation. With the turn to port, the line begins to settle in a slight arc, and the single largest battle line of steel warships ever assembled is ready for action, the names of many ships steeped in history. From the front of the line to the back are King George V, Ajax, Centurion, Erin, Orion, Monarch, Conqueror, Thunderer, Iron Duke, Royal Oak, Superb, Canada, Benbow, Bellerophon, Temeraire, Vanguard, Colossus, Collingwood, Neptune, St. Vincent, Marlborough, Revenge, Hercules, Agincourt, Barham, Valiant, Warspite, and Malaya. Even as the Grand Fleet sets itself up for combat, somewhat further south, things are not going so ideally. Whilst 5th Battle Squadron has managed to extract itself northwards and append itself to the stern of the Grand Fleet, fighting between the two closing fleets is still ongoing in other areas. First Scouting Group has rejoined the High Seas Fleet, and they are all now heading north to try and re-engage Beatty. They genuinely have no idea the Grand Fleet is at sea, let alone practically on top of them. In fact, at this point, Shear's thoughts were,
some steps would also have to be taken to shake off the English line forces before the darkness fell, in order to avoid any loss to our main fleet from nocturnal torpedo boat attacks.
Whilst Shear suspects that the Grand Fleet might be now at sea somewhere, he thinks they're probably going to show up in this area the next day, and is mainly concerned with ensuring that his fleet is ready to face them at that point. And to be fair, there are a few closer issues to attend to. Between the two fleets, Beatty's Battlecruisers are crossing the face of the deploying Grand Fleet to try and link up with 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron and obscure any sight that the High Seas Fleet might get of the British battleships, whilst the bulk of 5th Battle Squadron is continuing north as it drops in on the rear of Grand Fleet's overall formation. But as all this is going on, lookouts aboard Lion spot the armoured cruisers of 1st Cruiser Squadron cutting in front of them. HMS Warrior is narrowly missed by Lion. Seemingly fixated on the drifting Wiesbaden, Admiral Arbuthnot has chosen possibly the single worst time to lead his ship south ahead of the capital ships in an attempt to finish off the lone crippled German cruiser. Nor is this the only near collision. The various other cruisers and destroyer units of the Grand Fleet have had to get out of the way of what is anticipated to be a very hot zone in the next few minutes, and they're trying to establish an order of battle astern of the battleships to the southwest, with occasional units coming under fire from various German ships as a number of far-flung units come within gun range of each other. The bemused battleships look on as their escorts try to extricate themselves from the sudden traffic jam and get into some semblance of order. Admiral Arbuthnot's luck truly runs out as HMS Defence and HMS Warrior enter gun range of Wiesbaden at about the same time as they also enter gun range of the leading elements of the High Seas Fleet and 1st Scouting Group. A steel rain of 11 and 12-inch shells pours in, and within moments HMS Defence's magazines detonate in yet another colossal fireball, visible from both the Grand and High Seas fleets. She vanishes beneath the waves with all hands, perhaps the most egregious casualty of the day. HMS Warrior is then subject to the same treatment and is hit badly, but at the last possible moment, respite arrives in the most unlikely form. Shrugging off spray, splinters and shells, HMS Warspite looms out of the setting sun with her steering gear motors overheated and her rudder jammed in a 10 degrees turn to starboard. Stopping would be suicide, and so Warspite instead powers on at full speed, inadvertently pulling a series of circles near and around the crippled Warrior. Presented with a much more valuable target, the Germans dutifully switch most of their fire to the Warspite, which takes over a dozen direct hits for its troubles, but remains an infuriatingly difficult target relative to the amount of firepower being directed at it. Eventually, Warspite regains control of her steering, and Warrior's somewhat bemused crew watches their unexpected saviour struggle off to the north. But by that point, the Germans have other issues to deal with apart from a single damaged armoured cruiser. Warspite gradually brings herself back into some semblance of order and heads away at a reduced speed, eventually being ordered back into port for repairs. Nonetheless, the Germans believe all 3 armoured cruisers and Warspite to be sunk at this point, with Scheer's post-war account mentioning the latter supposed sinking several times, and at points appearing to be almost personally insulted at Warspite's temerity in failing to slip beneath the waves. Even as all this was going on to the port quarter of the German formation, First Scouting Group has come into range of 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, as well as regaining contact with Beatty and the rest of the Battlecruiser fleet. The visibility is at first in the Royal Navy's favour, a microcosm of what Jellicoe is planning. Whilst 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron is made up of older battlecruisers that are vulnerable to German capital ships regardless of ammunition handling practices, if they can't be seen, they can't be hit, and their recent training at Scapa pays off. HMS Indefatigable rapidly scores 4 hits, 3 on Derflinger and 1 on Seydlitz. However, it's Lutzow who really catches the short end of the stick as she comes under fire from Lion, Inflexible and Invincible. 10 hits smash into the German flagship, and it is in fact Invincible, the oldest battlecruiser present, and indeed the first of its kind, that seals the ultimate fate of the newest battlecruiser present, when it puts 2 of the 8 shells it delivers to Lutzow in about as many minutes, just below the waterline forward, causing catastrophic progressive flooding that includes a breach of the large torpedo flat that controls the ship's submerged bow tubes. It's a mortal blow, but that death will take a while to come. Invincible's fate, however, is somewhat faster in coming. A gust of wind briefly clears the smoke and murk, exposing it to the clear view of Hipper's ships, and both Lutzow and Derflinger open up. 3 salvos each ring out, and within a minute and a half, it's all over. A shell smashes into her nearest amidships turret, and moments later an all-too-familiar flash of magazine detonation lights up the evening as 1,026 officers and men lose their lives in moments. Almost all of the few survivors were a handful of men atop the mainmast, which is blown clean off the ship, with them still at their stations. Amazingly, one of the others is from Q turret, the one that was hit. HMS Princess Royal takes a couple of hits from SMS Markgraf, but the action breaks off shortly thereafter. Lutzow has many systems offline and is taking on water fast. Admiral Hipper is therefore forced to take to SMS G39, a torpedo boat, and go looking for a working battlecruiser to lead from, as, amongst other things, the radio systems aboard Lutzow have been one of the many casualties. The reason for the break-off of the renewed battlecruiser action was rapidly obvious to all sides, for even as the clash had looked like the German battleships were coming into play against the British battlecruisers, to quote Admiral Scheer,
"It was now obvious that we were confronted by a large portion of the English fleet. The entire arc stretching from north to east was a sea of fire. The flash from the muzzles of the gun was seen distinctly through the mist and smoke on the horizon, although the ships themselves were not distinguishable."
The mixture of low light, mist and drifting smoke both from funnels and guns had worked to completely obscure the entire Grand Fleet battle line from the Germans, right up until the moment that dozens of flashes, followed shortly by fountains of water and fire, began to erupt in the gloom. The High Seas Fleet is caught completely off guard, confronted with an opponent they were, up until this moment, convinced was still in port, or at least only just out of it. Speaking of being caught off guard, the cruiser HMS Galatia is still trying to find its place in the formation and is just sailing past HMS Agincourt when the battleship fires a full 14-gun broadside, stunning the command crew of the hapless cruiser and leaving them feeling as if their whole ship had been briefly lifted out of the water and dropped back in again. But the time for disbelief on all sides is quickly over as hits begin to register on the German ships. In particular, HMS Iron Duke with Jellicoe aboard not only is the first ship to spot the High Seas Fleet, but then lands 7 hits within a handful of salvos on the hapless SMS Koenig. So long is the Grand Fleet's battle line that not all ships are able to open fire. Not helped by Beatty trying to bring his battlecruisers to the head of the line and getting in various squadrons' way, but the concentration against the lead elements of Scheer's forces is still overwhelming, and the level of fire grows as the range closes and more British battleships are able to range on their targets. Scheer rapidly appraises a number of factors. 1. Only his vanguard are in a position to return fire, and even then, with only a limited number of their main battery guns. 2. Their ability to do so is going to rapidly degrade in the immediate future as they take more and more hits. 3. His ships still can't see much. If anything, the Grand Fleet outside of gun flashes and hazy outlines is still pretty much invisible. 4. It's a trap. 5. He has no idea what else could be out there. For example, if British doctrine was anything like his own, then even at this moment dozens of British destroyers might be swarming towards him, about to envelop his forces in a maelstrom of torpedoes. And the first thing he'd know about it is when things start exploding, well, even more than they already are now. Jellicoe's call has been about as close to perfect as it's possible to be in this kind of engagement. He has Scheer exactly where every admiral since the dawn of the line of battle has wanted their opponent to be. Scheer is faced with a terrible quandary. If he keeps going, his force is going to be picked apart squadron by squadron. If he turns to engage in a broadside battle, he's simply outnumbered. The turning point would become a focus anyway and used to batter incoming ships, and his lead ships are already suffering. And even a conventional turnaway to escape would see almost every ship under his command battered and broken before they manage to pull out of range. The German ships are nonetheless quick to recover from the surprise and begin returning fire as best they can. A midshipman aboard HMS Collingwood writes,
"Shots fell around us, and we were straddled more than once. One short shot ricocheted, swerving to starboard. The shell was plainly visible, a reddish brown, probably an armour-piercing. When I saw the shell flying towards us, I remarked to Midshipman Stoneham, 'That shell is going to hit a turret.' It did not. It passed over the forecastle and fell into the sea close on our port side."
History avoided major change by a matter of only a few feet, for inside that turret was the future King George VI, then Prince Albert, and later to be father to Queen Elizabeth II. Difficult though the situation is, Scheer didn't get to be commander of the High Seas Fleet by writing in for a competition or winning it in a serial packet. He had in fact thought about this kind of problem beforehand and made preparations. And so he didn't need long to both realise what he had to do and how to do it. Within a couple of minutes of this phase of the battle being opened, he ordered his fleet to execute a Gefechtskehrwendung nach Steuerbord, or battle about turn to starboard. Fortunately, the flags were slightly shorter than the German words. This involved every ship simultaneously making a hard 180-degree turn, varying each ship's rudder angle and speed to keep station with its fellows, as ships of different classes had different performance characteristics when making this manoeuvre. This allowed the entire line to reverse course within minutes and maintain their line formation. It was a high-precision action that required the highest levels of skill and expertise from the ship's commanders and crews all along the High Seas Fleet battle line. But practice makes perfect, and a few minutes after the order was given, the High Seas Fleet faded back into the mists and darkness, away from the Grand Fleet's guns. Jellicoe is now faced with his own quandary. He could follow the High Seas Fleet and try to finish them off, but this would come with a number of risks. For a start, it would even the playing field when it came to visibility, and further, it would expose his ships to the possibility of waves of torpedoes that may have been fired to cover the High Seas Fleet's tracks. This latter problem was more of a concern. Retaining the cover of the mists was a major advantage, But even in an equal visibility scenario, Jellicoe had more ships and more and bigger guns, and so the torpedoes were the more proximate concern. His battleships were now sending reports in of torpedoes in the water and taking the necessary evasive action, and so, as a result, the Grand Fleet headed south in roughly the same direction as they'd been going previously, but not in a direct chase, keeping sheer to the west and also retaining the gunnery advantage of the light and mists. HMS Marlborough, in the rear division of the battle line, is hit by a torpedo, seeming to further reinforce the wisdom of Jellicoe's decision. In hindsight, the torpedo was probably from the crippled but still afloat SMS Wiesbaden, which was still defying everything in the vicinity, but this hit will gradually drop Marlborough's speed over the next few hours. But for now, she kept formation as the fleet slowed to a cruising speed, with the captain merely ordering that the guns be elevated higher to compensate for the list. Away to the west, Scheer knew that full darkness was some time off, and he did not know if he was being pursued, and if so, how closely. With the pre-dreadnoughts of Rear Admiral Mauve's squadron slowing him down, if Jellicoe was closing in to finish him off, then there was nothing he could do to escape, except perhaps sacrifice the stragglers and hope that a Dogger Bank-style feeding frenzy developed. Or possibly simply be somewhere else. Thus, he decided to head east. This was because a pursuing enemy would, at best, run past Scheer's western flank with his ships hidden in the darkness, and if the pursuit was off by a few degrees and they still managed to spot the High Seas Fleet, it could fall further back east into the gathering night and make an escape for good. If the course of pursuit was off by a few degrees to the west, they'd miss the High Seas Fleet entirely. Now, if the enemy was significantly to the east already, Scheer also viewed it to be better to force them to use their destroyers and torpedo boat payloads before nightfall, when the High Seas Fleet still had a chance to spot and dodge these weapons. In his own words at the time,
"If the enemy followed us, our action in reversing course would have been classed as a retreat, and if any of our rear ships were damaged, we would have to sacrifice them. Still, less was it feasible to disengage, leaving it to the enemy to decide when he would meet with us in the morning."
Unfortunately for Scheer, Jellicoe wasn't following him, but was, as mentioned, heading south, which meant that Scheer had managed to extract himself from the Grand Fleet crossing his T once, only to now unintentionally be driving his fleet headlong into exactly the same trap, with the British holding exactly the same advantages, only now Scheer's own ships were damaged, and there was an even greater visibility disadvantage compared to before as the sun continued to set. Emphasising just how spread out this battle had become, not only were the four main formations of the two fleets out there, so too were a number of crippled ships: HMS Warrior, HMS Warspite, SMS Wiesbaden, and the destroyer HMS Shark, to name but a few. The latter now caught up in her own small fight with 4 German torpedo boats. And despite the odds, she put up a heroic resistance, disabling SMS V-48 before SMS S-54 put a torpedo into her after about 5 minutes, sending the valiant Shark to the bottom. Second Light Cruiser Squadron is once again the first part of the fleet to notice the returning Germans, and commences evasive action whilst signalling that, well, the High Seas Fleet is back again, even as the shells begin to splash down around them, evoking memories of a few hours earlier. Scheer finds himself in a familiar and unwelcome position. For the second time that day, the horizon lights up in flames. This time it's the eastern one, and unlike the previous encounter, Jellicoe has had a bit more time to bring his line into a closer formation, as compared to the previous barely deployed arc. And the incoming fire rapidly begins to tell. Within the space of a couple of minutes, the 5 leading German battleships have all been hit, along with a number of other following vessels. The whole purpose of Scheer's turn east was to evade the Grand Fleet, not smash his damaged vanguard headlong into it once again. and so Scheer orders the about turn once more. But unlike the previous instance, he has some major problems. With hits sending fire and debris all over the place, the forward elements of the High Seas Fleet are beginning to lose cohesion, and even though the turn will preserve most of the middle and rear divisions, it's going to leave half a dozen battleships under fire of 4 to 5 times their number of capital ships as they lose speed in their turns, something that a number of German dreadnoughts are quite bad at doing. A third squadron, in the lead, along with First Scouting Group, is already getting badly hit. And so Scheer plays his last card. All destroyers and torpedo boats, 6 flotillas with over 200 torpedoes still aboard, are ordered forward for a torpedo assault, and any surviving operational battlecruisers are ordered headlong at the British to distract them from the High Seas Fleet itself. Although, recognising the situation, some of the German torpedo boats have already headed into the attack on their own initiative. Hipper is still stuck between ships and can only watch as the Iron Dog, Derflinger, leads the 3 other operational German battlecruisers into a point-blank charge against 4.5 to 1 odds, whilst the High Seas Fleet hauls about behind them. Although the manoeuvre is much more disorganised this time, with some ships turning to port instead of starboard, others turning early, and still others finding themselves squeezed out of the line and forced to run parallel to their comrades until everything can be sorted out. This set of manoeuvres will become known as the death ride of the German battlecruisers, a bold German strategy that actually works in their favour. So many British ships are firing at so few targets that working out whose shells belong to which ship becomes remarkably difficult, and the German ships are almost perpetually hidden in columns of water, smoke and spray, vastly reducing the odds of actually getting the range correct. Nonetheless, quantity does have a quality all of its own, and 37 large caliber hits tear into 3 of the 4 battlecruisers. For its trouble in leading the attack, 2 of Derflinger's turrets are wrecked, and in exchange, a pair of 11-inch shells from Seydlitz hits HMS Colossus, causing superficial damage, and further heavy damage is inflicted on the rest of the German battlecruisers. Even the by now heavily listing Marlborough scores a number of hits. As the German ships wheel about to make their own escape, this is covered by the follow-up assault by the destroyers and torpedo boats, rather diverting British attention. Iron Duke once again takes an incredibly accurate aim and casually obliterates SMS S-35, which was angling for a torpedo spread on the Grand Fleet flagship. But 31 torpedoes make it into the water, and in order to preserve the fleet, Jellicoe orders his ships to turn away from the incoming weapons again. In this, he is successful in avoiding damage, although a number of bemused sailors are able to watch the torpedoes motor on past them close enough to make out details of their construction, whilst the escorting British vessels also manage to bag SMS V-48. With the torpedo threat over, Jellicoe wheels the fleet about again, but the delay has cost what was left of the daylight and opened the range significantly. Scheer has once more slipped away into the night. Despite progressive flooding, Boyer Smith aboard Marlborough seemed content with matters.
Everything seemed splendid. We were doing a good 17 knots, list and all, with a boiler room on the point of flooding outright. At present, there was 6 feet of water in it. We were keeping our place in the line, and the Grand Fleet was still between them and home, and with a whole day before us this time. Make a job of it one way or the other.
The outlying elements of the 2 fleets exchange a few final salvos. The trailing, battered German battlecruisers are set upon by their pursuing British counterparts. A single hit on Princess Royal is compensated for with 8 further hits on the German ships, but just as it looks like the battered and slowed German battlecruisers have finally been run to the ground, out of the gathering gloom comes the pre-dreadnoughts of the High Seas Fleet's Second Squadron, which engage the British in a short but fierce gunnery duel. It's quite one-sided, the pre-dreadnoughts falling back under fire within minutes, But they've done their job, holding up the British chase just long enough for the German battlecruisers to gain cover in what is now definitely the night, as the sun had set at 2000 hours. Without knowing it, these ships have fired the last shots that will be exchanged by British and German capital ships until the Second World War. Jellicoe now has a big decision to make. He can steam on into the gloom of night in battle line formation. Visibility was poor during the day, and it's terrible now, but from the last few encounters, he does have a rough idea of where Scheer might be for the next half hour or so. But this risks exposing the Grand Fleet to a night action where the limited visibility will curtail his ability to use the full numerical advantage of the Grand Fleet, and will also conceal destroyers and cruisers making torpedo runs. Jellicoe also knows that the High Seas Fleet has spent a lot more time practicing for a night engagement than he has. Whilst filing away a mental note to change that, he resolves instead to angle the Grand Fleet to sail in the direction of where Scheer has to be going, home, in order to cut him off and force a renewed action at dawn, where the sun rising behind his ships will illuminate the Germans for his gunners whilst blinding Scheer's. The only issue is where to go. The approaches to the German coast are heavily mined, but the British know that there are 4 safe routes through. The one that both sides discount immediately was going around Denmark and into the Baltic, then coming back via the Kiel Canal. It was by far the longest route, and although it would break contact most cleanly with the British, there were a number of ships such as Seydlitz which would not likely survive the trip, and thus Scheer has completely disregarded this already. The 3 routes that involve heading south involve going via the Heligoland Bight, the North Frisian coast, or the Horns Reef. Scheer has also ruled out going via Heligoland Bight, as this requires entering the minefields that start well out to sea, and with only Dead Reckoning available, there's no way he can guarantee showing up at the entrance. The Germans had already lost enough ships to their own mines without running the whole High Seas Fleet into them. The next choice was to head for the Frisian coast and then double back behind a minefield into the Jade Estuary. This course diverged from the British route somewhat, but was still relatively close. The final option, the shortest, was south by southeast to the Horns Reef. It was the shortest route by at least 100 miles, but it would involve cutting back across the course of where Scheer now knows the Grand Fleet to be. With a sighting that put the High Seas Fleet on a west-southwest course, Jellicoe concluded that the Frisian coast was the most likely option. It matched the sighting of the High Seas Fleet, and it also matched Scheer's apparent desire to stay away from the Grand Fleet. In theory, if given enough warning, heading in this direction would also allow him to switch course to the Horns Reef, which should come if the Germans tried to break through his lines, as the destroyer and cruiser squadrons were distributed around the Grand Fleet for exactly this tripwire purpose. With the Grand Fleet enjoying both a cruising and maximum speed advantage, courtesy of Rear Admiral Merv's pre-dreadnoughts in the High Seas Fleet, he could still beat Scheer to either destination as long as he had enough timely information. Jellicoe orders the fleet into night formation. The battle line is replaced with 4 parallel columns that reduce the fleet's overall footprint, making it easier to form an escort cordon and reducing the chances of being found by German torpedo boats and destroyers. In the 3rd column, poor old Marlborough, the flagship of the division, was gradually falling back. Having taken the torpedo hit earlier, she was sure she could keep 17 knots, but the list was slowly increasing and her speed was slowly dropping. For the moment, she was keeping vaguely in contact, but it was looking more and more dicey as time went on. The remains of the Battlecruiser fleet were stationed ahead and to starboard, which was the best location for them to head off the lead German ships if they were heading where Jellicoe thought they were. Weirdly, this meant that within 10 minutes, unknown to anyone, the Battlecruiser fleet actually became the lead element of the High Seas Fleet, which was motoring along almost 8 miles directly behind them in the darkness. One cruiser squadron was placed at each compass point around the Grand Fleet, except to the west, where 2 were stationed to ensure that the battlecruiser fleet had enough support, with the destroyers all sent to follow the fleet to guard the back of the British formation, as well as keep the fire lanes ahead and to the sides clear should an engagement develop. Aboard the various ships, there is finally time for crews to be taking something of a break. Aboard HMS Barham, Midshipman Frampton noted,
"We were allowed to take it in turns to leave the turret and find what we could to eat. My dismay can be imagined when I saw the gun room, which of course I expected to find as usual. It was a complete shambles, both inside and out, and there was obviously no hope of getting anything to eat there. I remember among other things the butter dish which had been blown with its contents out the pantry and stuck to the bulkhead. The wardroom was intact, and we were invited to take part in the feast, such as it was. Some tongue, biscuits and a drink was about all, but it revived us."
Poor Boyer Smith in Marlborough had to make do with a biscuit that he'd stashed in the turret before the action commenced, while Lieutenant Brind in Malaya was slightly more fortunate.
"I was very glad of a sandwich of bread and tinned salmon, which was served out. Nothing warm could be obtained as the gallery was out of action. The men managed to get some sleep during the night, but I was not so fortunate, as my perch was not very comfortable, and I hardly dared sleep, for it seemed so necessary to be absolutely ready."
The Germans, meanwhile, proceeded in line ahead, now changing course to just a fraction south of southwest, although the Westfalen seems to have had some trouble complying and meanders back and forth across nearby bearings for a little bit until it can sort itself out. In preparation for having to break past the Grand Fleet, Scheer had previously ordered Commodore Michelson of SMS Rostock, who was in charge of the High Seas Fleet's destroyers, to prepare to attack the British forces. His first task was to actually find some, and then work out if they had any torpedoes. In so doing, he found SMS Regensburg, whose own Commodore was in charge of First Scouting Group's destroyers. Between the two of them, they gathered together various destroyer formations, but a number of initial forays were spotted in the failing light and abandoned when the vessels came under fire. With their boilers increasingly clogged due to poor quality coal and visibility worsening, some of the destroyers were now fired at by the High Seas Fleet's own battleships, which further complicated matters. All of this meant that the destroyers were being slowed up, which in turn meant that they'd missed the Grand Fleet and run into the British destroyers and cruisers at the rear of the formation instead. Scheer realised that the somewhat bruised and battered pre-dreadnoughts of the Second Battle Squadron were leading the High Seas Fleet. Not exactly what he wanted if he was going to potentially run into Jellicoe for a third time. Here, the first chance for a night action occurred as, whilst trying to follow Scheer's order to drop out of line and rejoin at the rear, SMS Hanover spotted a light ahead along with a number of large vessels. This was in fact HMS Shannon of the 2nd Cruiser Squadron. Without that light in place, which should have been out, there was a good chance that the pre-dreadnoughts could have walked right into 2nd Cruiser Squadron and their torpedo and gunfire, and that would have most definitely alerted the Grand Fleet to yet another T-crossing opportunity. But with the light seen, the German fleet held back and gradually fell behind into a position where they would cut across the back of the Grand Fleet instead of running headlong into it. In another lucky mistake, 4th Scouting Group, assigned to the starboard bow quarter of the High Seas Fleet, ended up on the port bow quarter, thus also avoiding a course into the rear elements of the Grand Fleet's battleships. There was further confusion at the rear of the German lines. Scheer had ordered 1st Scouting Group to drop in behind the pre-dreadnoughts due to the damage that they'd taken, but Hipper had by now only just managed to find a new command, SMS Moltke, and missed the signals, instead trying to take his ships back into the lead. Lutzow was still afloat, but taking on water fast. Derflinger was doing a good impression of an underwater Swiss cheese, and von der Tann was cleaning out her boilers from built-up soot and ash. And so only Moltke, and believe it or not, the battered Seydlitz, could actually manage to get to the front lines. Scheer repeated his orders as he noticed two of First Scouting Group's battlecruisers pass by, but by that point the two more seaworthy battlecruisers had reached the front line and would then have to make their own way forwards. SMS Frankfurt and SMS Pillau spot the 16 ships of 11th Destroyer Flotilla, although at first they think that it's actually 5 cruisers. Either way, torpedoes are fired off into the night, but shortly after firing them, the Germans recognise the destroyers for what they are, and they decide that bringing 16 hostile destroyers back to the High Seas Fleet is not such a good idea, and refrain from firing guns or using their searchlights. However, the 11th Destroyer Flotilla is heading for a station rear of the British battleships, and so, completely unaware of what's going on, doubles back to assume their station, thus inadvertently causing all the torpedoes to go wide. 10 minutes later, a formation of German destroyers spots 4th Destroyer Flotilla and once again launches a stealth attack with torpedoes, only to, once again, see the British do a smart about-face to assume escort positions, and so, yet again, the torpedoes go wide. Although Jellicoe is fairly convinced he's got his approximation of the German course and speed right, just in case, the mine layer HMS Abdeel is sent to lay her mines off of the Horns Reef approach. As the bedraggled elements of the High Seas Fleet begin to cross the wake of the Grand Fleet, the first of many sporadic encounters breaks out. Second Light Cruiser Squadron's flagship, HMS Southampton, spots 5 ships at point-blank range. After some back and forth with challenge signals and misidentifications, both sides open fire, with most German ships of 4th Scouting Group gunning for HMS Southampton, whilst one takes aim at HMS Dublin. HMS Nottingham and HMS Birmingham have no lights running, and thus remain unseen. Southampton takes a withering barrage, but manages to get a torpedo off which deals a fatal blow to SMS Frauenlob, which takes all but 5 of her 330-man crew to the bottom, the action breaking off almost as quickly as it began. Southampton's torpedo lieutenant relates the action.
At about 10:15 p.m, there appeared on our starboard beam, scarcely 1,500 yards distant, a line of 5 ships steering in the same direction as ourselves. We intersected them carefully from the bridge, and the officers in the after control position also observed and reported their presence to us. The next few minutes were full of suspense, the newcomers being as unwilling to disclose their identity as we were. Meanwhilst a cautionary order were passed to the guns and the searchlights, and I have the order to flood the starboard torpedo ready for firing. Then the 2 squadrons almost simultaneously decided the other was hostile and opened a violent fire. Each of the 5 German ships switched on 2 groups of lights and opened fire, at least 3 ships very speedily concentrating on Southampton, which, with searchlights burning, made an excellent target. The others finding and engaging Dublin, our next astern. Neither Nottingham nor Birmingham showed any lights, with the result that they remained undiscovered and were unable to pour a heavy fire onto the enemy at almost point-blank range. On the bridge, the full glare of the searchlights of the leading enemy ship was on us, and we could see nothing. But I had already received enough of an impression of the general direction of enemy advance for the purpose of torpedo fire, so I passed down the order to the torpedo flat and waited impatiently for the reply. When it came through, the report, "Ready," I fired at the group of hostile searchlights, which were the only things visible. The Commodore came over to my side and asked if I had fired. I told him I had, and that the tube crews were reloading. I began to look round. It was impossible to distinguish the firing of our own guns from the noise of the bursting shells. I remember the continuous screaming noise, apparently caused by overs, but I could see nothing of the results of our own firing owing to the glare of the searchlights. I received no definite impression that the ship had been struck by shells, only a confused uproar. I did not find out the true affairs of the states on deck until it was all over. I observed that a fire had been started on board somewhere aft, which was hidden by another which shot up just abaft of the bridge, nearly to the foretop. Our firing and the enemy's now became too desultory, and there were brief periods of calm, where there was little else to do but watch the fire, which was within a few feet of the bridge screens, and, having seen the 3 ships blow up earlier in the day, I wondered how long it would be before we made the 4th, and what it would feel like. Just as we had made up our minds that another few minutes would surely see the end of Southampton, the searchlights from the leading enemy ship went out and she sheered off to starboard. She had been torpedoed and was sinking, though we did not know it at the time.
"11th Destroyer Flotilla is spotted again by 4th Scouting Group, along with Elbing and Rostock. This time the approach is different. During the earlier encounters, the British challenge signal, issued by searchlight at night, had been observed, and so by using this, the Germans were able to pretend to be in approaching Royal Navy formation until they get to about a mile away, at which point all searchlights and guns are lit up and the 11th Destroyer Flotilla is taken under fire. Torpedoes are soon in the water, and surprisingly the action breaks off as both sides withdraw. HMS Castor being hit repeatedly, whilst some hits were scored on SMS Hamburg. Elbing has a lucky escape, for now, as a deep-running torpedo is spotted passing right underneath the ship. 11th Destroyer Flotilla reports the contact to Jellicoe, but lists the enemies as light forces, i.e. torpedo boats, which is pretty much what Jellicoe was expecting. Jellicoe receives a Room 40 report from the Admiralty, which indicates that, based on a German signal from just after 2100, the High Seas Fleet is headed for Horns Reef. Unfortunately, Jellicoe is highly sceptical and disregards it, which is another huge missed opportunity. But from his perspective at the time, there's actually good reason for this action. That morning he'd been told by the Admiralty that the High Seas Fleet was still in port. That had been a result of failures on the part of Admiralty officers not actually asking Room 40 the right questions, but Jellicoe of course didn't know that. He'd also received another signal half an hour previously that gave a completely different and obviously wrong position. Specifically, it suggested that the High Seas Fleet was somehow south of the Grand Fleet, which Jellicoe knew for a fact was wrong, since all the sighting reports from his own ships were coming from the north, and the signal's reported position would have required the High Seas Fleet to have uniformly been capable of well over 30 knots. A number of other signals had been intercepted by Room 40, which would have confirmed the report that he'd just received, but the Admiralty had, unforgivably, left a junior officer on duty who had little idea what he was looking at, and so these other signals were not forwarded to Jellicoe. These included a request from Scheer for Zeppelin reconnaissance in the morning over Horns Reef. If they had been, then at least the weight of similar-sounding reports might have led Jellicoe to changing course, and perhaps changing history. It wasn't just inconsistent Admiralty signals that played into this decision. There were also sighting reports from the Grand Fleet and Battlecruiser fleet that seemed to go against this, as well as other Admiralty signals that seemed to have been borne out. For example, just before 2200, Jellicoe had received an intercepted signal detailing Scheer's instructions for a nighttime torpedo boat attack, which seemed to coincide with the reports that were reaching him from his own forces, such as 11th Destroyer Flotilla's identification of torpedo boats attacking them. Of course, we know 11th Destroyer Flotilla was wrong, but Jellicoe didn't know that. Additionally, his own cruisers had reported seeing German capital ships heading southwest. This was technically correct, but practically wrong. The ships they'd seen were indeed heading southwest, but they were only doing this briefly as they turned to head to the rear of the German line. But the sighting, which had only briefly spotted the German ships, thus gave a mistaken idea that this was where all German capital ships must have been going. In any case, after Jellicoe received the signal claiming that the High Seas Fleet was heading for the Horns Reef, Room 40 was also in receipt of the following. 1. A message from Scheer confirming that he was on a course of southeast by south. 2. A message from Scheer ordering torpedo boats to assemble at 0200 at Horns Reef, or to take another course home if they couldn't make that rendezvous. And 3. As the night wore on, further reports from Scheer as to his course and position sent at 2306, 2330, 2336, 0043 and 0103, each of them decoded within about half an hour of Shear's sending them. None of these signals were passed on to the Grand Fleet. Conversely, some of the few British signals from the Grand Fleet were picked up by the Germans, which allowed Shear to understand that clashes with British destroyers meant that he was passing behind, instead of in front of, the Grand Fleet. But whilst we're on the subject of Shear's intentions to get home, let's learn a little bit more about that Zeppelin reconnaissance he'd asked for.
Unlike the British, the Germans decided to field Zeppelins in order to help the Kaiserliche Marine locate the enemy. While larger, sluggish, and a bigger target, Zeppelins had advantages over aircraft. They had greater range, more crew to assist with spotting, able to bear more equipment, and fuel autonomy. Zeppelins were also greatly favored by the German Navy over conventional aircraft, with officers and captains having gone through the officer schools for the Kaiserliche Marine. The Germans deployed 5 Zeppelins on the 31st of May to find the British fleet, and seems to have come close to doing so, albeit a little bit too late. During the night of the 1st of June, between 3:15 and 3:45 am, multiple British ships reported hearing engine sounds. The Zeppelins were close, but the night, and later the same poor visibility that had forced Jutland on the British side to stay low, prevented the Germans from getting eyes on the Royal Navy. The British of course did not notice, and Jellicoe seems to have assumed that perhaps the Germans had indeed spotted his fleet. Yet the Zeppelins were unable to play much of a part in the battle or assist the Kaiserliche Marine. The airships returned to their mooring stations. On the 1st of June 1916, at dawn, one airship, L-11 or L-11, was sent out again. This time it was able to spot the British fleet, taking some pot shots as a reward, but slipping away without any damage. By this point, the battle was over. Seeing no damaged stragglers that could be picked off by the German Navy, L-11 retired, playing no further part in a battle that was already long over.
Fourth Destroyer Flotilla was the westernmost unit guarding the rear of the Grand Fleet, and was made up of 2 flotilla leaders, HMS Tipperary and HMS Broke, and a balance of Acasta-class destroyers. HMS Garland, fourth in line, reported unknown ships approaching. These were duly challenged, but the response from 600 yards away was simply a hail of gunfire. It was actually 4th Scouting Group again, this time just ahead of the leading High Seas Fleet battleships, and at almost the same time, SMS Westfalen and SMS Nassau also opened up with their secondary batteries. Recognising themselves as hopelessly outgunned, the leading 6 destroyers fired torpedoes and turned away. This was another golden moment, as the rest of the flotilla was still fully loaded, but even at this almost point-blank distance, in the darkness, many of them were unsure if this was actually enemy forces or a bad case of friendly fire, and so none of the other destroyers launched torpedoes, and those that had fired had only fired 1 or 2 each to preserve their loads in case of future action. Still, SMS Elbing's luck now well and truly ran out. She was hit by one of the torpedoes and slewed around, losing speed, only to be promptly rammed by the oncoming SMS Posen, which sealed her fate. In exchange, the flotilla leader Tipperary was aflame and disabled. HMS Spitfire, next in line, decided to move to assist, but now SMS Nassau loomed up out of the gloom, aiming to ram the British destroyer. Spitfire took last-minute evasive action, prompting Nassau to try and blast it from the water with its main battery, but the range was so close that the 11-inch guns could not depress far enough, and they only blew part of the mast and funnel overboard, as well as doing some serious redecoration of the superstructure. The 2 ships then hit each other, almost head-on, Spitfire scraping down the side of the much larger German ship, her own hull crumpling, but also ripping open the side of Nassau. As the 2 ships parted, a 20-foot chunk of Nassau's armour plating was torn away, landing on Spitfire's forecastle. With engine power still available, the rather bedraggled Spitfire limped away towards home, with her prize firmly on deck. HMS Broke now took over command from Tipperary, but did not report the encounter to Jellicoe. Another mischance. But 25 minutes after the first gunfire, they had more ships to worry about as Westfalen appeared and opened fire at less than a ship's length distance. Broke was shattered in moments, the close range preventing the return fire of her own torpedoes, and the crippled ship swerved out of line and hit HMS Sparrowhawk, which was trying to line up its own torpedo shot. The captain of Sparrowhawk saw the collision coming, shouted a warning, and then was knocked off his feet and into unconsciousness by the impact, coming to a few minutes later and finding that he'd been forcibly transferred to the deck of Broke. As the officers tried to figure out which ship was worse off and thus whose crew should evacuate to the other ship, HMS Contest rolled up behind them and took a bit out of Sparrowhawk's stern before proceeding on her own way with a sheepish apology. After some time, the two ships were able to separate, Broke missing her bow, slowly meandering back home over the next few days, whilst Sparrowhawk could only go in circles. As they went round and round through the night, they spotted the abandoned and drifting SMS Elbing come past and sink, before Sparrowhawk was eventually taken in tow, but then deliberately sunk the following day, due to increased flooding as the seas built. HMS Agthe took command of what was left of 4th Destroyer Flotilla, but still made no report to Jellicoe. Next in line was 13th Destroyer Flotilla, made up of the light cruiser HMS Champion and a number of M-class destroyers, minus a few that had been lost or damaged earlier in the day, but plus HMS Termagant and HMS Turbulent from the 10th Flotilla. Champion spotted the fighting 4th Destroyer Flotilla was stuck in and tried to head for a better view, but forgot to tell the rest of the ships in formation, who were all travelling without lights and following the next ship in line. Thus, only the first two following destroyers actually realised what was going on and followed Champion. But the next squadrons, further east, saw Champion's movement and likewise moved themselves. This opened up a gap for the High Seas Fleet to pass through, and once again, both the observed fighting and the repositioning of ships were not reported to Jellicoe. Moltke and Seydlitz were making their own way home. Seydlitz because she was so badly damaged that with progressive flooding she was beginning to fall behind, and Moltke because she'd gotten lost. She'd already almost run into Second Battle Squadron, although HMS Thunderer had both not fired on her nor reported the sighting. She tried to break through twice more, both times almost running into the Grand Fleet, and so after an exchange of messages, Scheer ordered Moltke to proceed at speed south and loop around the front of the British forces, which she would eventually manage to do. The last action of the 31st of May was once again characterised by a failure to act or to report. Seydlitz wandered into range of First Battle Squadron and was seen by Marlborough, Agincourt and Revenge. The first two did nothing, and Revenge challenged the stranger, got an incorrect response, but then chose to do nothing about it. Two light cruisers pretty much did the same, and so the shattered Battlecruiser was able to crawl past on her way to safety. HMS Black Prince, a survivor of Admiral Arbuthnot's ill-advised charge earlier in the battle, has become lost. Seeing a line of battleships, she tries to join up again, only to find she's actually sailing alongside the High Seas Fleet, which opens up a massive cannonade at point-blank range that sees the ship suffer the same fate as HMS Defence, blown up with all hands lost. The German ships now start passing through a line of destroyers made up of a couple of combined flotillas and some from 13th Destroyer Flotilla who'd gotten lost after being left behind and joined up with the first British unit they'd found. SMS Westfalen again featured, running HMS Turbulent down as the destroyers once again did not report the sightings. Thanks to the damage inflicted earlier on HMS Marlborough, her part of First Battle Squadron had fallen back, and 12th Destroyer Flotilla had likewise dropped back to stay at escorting distance. Thus, instead of having the German ships run through them, the 15 destroyers instead see ships passing ahead of them. They fail to respond to challenges properly, and the flotilla, under Captain Stirling, begins an attack in the pre-dawn darkness. The High Seas Fleet responds with a heavy barrage that drives back almost 2/3 of the attackers, but half a dozen manage to get into torpedo range before having to turn about. Minutes later, SMS Pommern is hit. Aboard HMS Obedient, an officer records,
"Right amidship in the Pommern appeared a dull red ball of fire. It spread fore and aft and flared up the mast in big red tongues of flame, uniting in a black cloud of smoke and sparks. Then one saw the ends of the ship come up as though her back was broken before the mist shut her out of view."
For a change, the lead officer does attempt to alert Jellicoe, but Stirling's efforts are frustrated by either damage to his own radio aerials or possibly German jamming, and 3 reports all fail to get through. This is the last encounter where there is still time for the Grand Fleet to hook around and block the High Seas Fleet, but it too is an opportunity missed, although this time not for lack of trying. Elsewhere in the darkness, the Lutzow's crew are forced to give up their fight to save the ship. With the torpedo flat flooded, the bow has sunk so far down that the propellers at the other end have emerged from the water and she's lost practically all speed. A number of destroyers take off the crew and she is torpedoed to hasten the end. The leading ships of 13th Destroyer Flotilla have regrouped and headed south. 10 minutes later, they spot the last few German ships, but again fail to report it and break away instead of engaging, with the exception of the tail-end vessel, HMS Moresby, which fires a torpedo before following the rest of the flotilla into the eastern darkness. One of the last 4 ships in the German line, SMS von der Tann, spots the torpedo and has to make an emergency turn to starboard to avoid it, and even then only just manages it. As you might imagine, all of this caused a semi-constant rolling cannonade punctuated by explosions to the north of the main Grand Fleet throughout the night. But many dismissed it as actions between opposing destroyer flotillas. After all, if it was the German fleet, then surely the squadron commanders in the rear units would tell Jellicoe what was happening, and, well, be asking for help. Meanwhile, those squadron leaders assumed that, for some reason, Jellicoe had X-ray vision and could see what they could see, and so radio signals or signal guns were a completely unnecessary risk, since obviously if Jellicoe wanted them to fire, then surely he would fire himself. As a result, various parts of the Grand Fleet watched as one German unit after another sailed quietly past at ranges where any actual gunfire would almost certainly have resulted in the German ship's destruction. Aboard the German fleet, it's estimated that they've managed to sink another battlecruiser and damage several more, as well as the various smaller craft. The sheer size of some of the more regular armoured cruisers, coupled with incomplete information regarding which ships were actually part of the Grand Fleet, further exacerbates this reporting issue. Post-war, finding out just how close to the Grand Fleet they came, Scheer can't believe he got away with it, any more than many other historians do, finding himself at a loss to explain how, or why, the various British units he just ploughed straight through, or was observed by, had never told Jellicoe what was happening. By means of further signals intercepts and reports finally filtering through to the fleet, Jellicoe now learns where Scheer is. But it's too far to the northeast now for the Grand Fleet to intercept the High Seas Fleet before it reaches Horn's Reef. With the German fleet now safely over to the eastern side of the Grand Fleet, Scheer has a clear run to head for the Horn's Reef and safety. But now, SMS Ostfriesland hits a mine. Luckily, after a few minutes, she's able to get underway again. A battered High Seas Fleet begins to make its way into port. Seydlitz, badly damaged and low in the water, grounds trying to cross the shallow bar that lies outside Safe Harbour. After some emergency lightning procedures and pumping assistance from tugs and a tow, she eventually makes it over at high tide, limping into her berth at 07:30 the next day, the 2nd of June, where she promptly sinks the last few feet to the sea floor. Far away to the northwest, the Grand Fleet and what's left of the Battlecruiser fleet are likewise heading for home, preceded by the damaged ships detached earlier the previous day, Marlborough, Warspite, Spitfire, and others. The Battle of Jutland is over. So the guns had fallen silent, the ships were back in port, the Battle of Jutland was done, but who had won? What would the outcomes be longer term, and what lessons had been learned? So as the gun smoke cleared on the 1st of June 1916, what exactly had happened at the Battle of Jutland? Who'd won? Who'd lost? And what outcome and impact would there be as a result of it on the overall war? Well, the outcome of the battle was not immediately clear to either side, and indeed, propaganda would start almost immediately. In this respect, the Germans were first off the mark. Even as Seydlitz was resting her battered bones on the bottom of the harbour on 2nd of June 1916, the German government released a statement to the world's press announcing a great victory, acknowledging only the loss of Pommern and Wiesbaden in exchange for the apparent sinking of a British battleship, 2 Battlecruisers, 2 armoured cruisers, a light cruiser, a submarine from somewhere, and some destroyers, which, curiously, was actually completely at odds with Scheer's own estimation, which was that his forces had managed to sink Warspite, 3 battlecruisers, 4 armoured cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Nevertheless, national celebrations and a children's holiday were announced, a stance which would be the official German narrative well into the 1950s. With the Royal Navy having to trek all the way back across the North Sea, the British were not able to count their losses quite as quickly, and the early release of damaged vessels to return home compounded the situation, as around the same time that the Germans were broadcasting their triumph, all the civilians on the UK's east coast could see were a few battered and listing vessels limping home, which seemed to give credence to the German claims. As the rest of the fleet arrived and crews went ashore, a steady trickle of telegrams and phone calls began to work their way across the country, with inevitable confusion, as some would arrive home to find well-meaning friends had reported them dead already. Warspite, one of the first battleships to make it back to port, was pelted with coal and insults from the bridge that it passed under on its way in for repairs. In the evening of the same day, the Admiralty released a preliminary estimate of losses based on Jellicoe's reports. Of course, British losses were by then pretty much known, whilst estimates of German losses were much harder to accurately gauge since many of them had occurred in the night. But the British press, expecting Jutland to have been a second Trafalgar, took the minimal information as some form of cover-up and secrecy and ran with the German narrative, prompting the release on the 3rd of June of another, and then later on the same day a third estimate of German losses, each larger than the previous one. Eventually, the Admiralty would claim 2 dreadnought battleships and 1 pre-dreadnought battleship definitely sunk, with another dreadnought battleship and a battlecruiser, or possibly 2 further dreadnought battleships as probably sunk, along with 5 light cruisers, 9 torpedo boats, of which 3 were considered probable only, and 4 submarines, with 3 of these being considered probable only. Still, the German narrative held sway for most of the week, until on the 7th, unable to conceal it any longer, the High Seas Fleet also admitted the loss of Lützow and Rostock, although the loss of Elbing was still withheld, possibly due to the embarrassing nature of the loss to one of her own side. This began to change public opinion, as the Admiralty's release of British losses roughly coincided with or even exceeded German claims, with the caveat of the capital ship losses being 3 battlecruisers and not a dreadnought battleship and 2 battlecruisers, whilst the German admission that they'd been hiding some losses badly dented their credibility and even persuaded many to believe some of the Admiralty's somewhat more speculative claims. Thus, by the end of June, the international press was moving towards the sense of a partial British victory, enhanced by further information that showed that the battle had ended with the High Seas Fleet running for port and the Grand Fleet off the German coast looking for a fight, with the ditty run in one newspaper of "The Germans cry we've won, but 'tis a curious view, when it is the conquerors that run, and the vanquished that pursue." Or, as one American newspaper rather unsubtly put it, "The prisoner has assaulted his jailer, but is still in jail. By July, the far worse loss of life at the Battle of the Somme put the ongoing argument out of most people's minds for the time being. But in truth, what had actually happened? In terms of casualties, the British had undoubtedly come off worse, with 6,784 killed against 3,039 on the German side, the bulk of deaths on both sides being from ships that had gone down with all hands or near enough. The British had also lost 113,300 tons of shipping against 62,300 tons on the German side, with the actual true losses consisting of, on the British side, the Battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary and Invincible, the armoured cruisers Black Prince, Warrior and Defence, the flotilla leader Tipperary, and the destroyers Shark, Sparrowhawk, Turbulent, Ardent, Fortune, Nomad and Nestor. On the German side, they had lost the battlecruiser Lützow, the pre-dreadnought battleship Pommern, the light cruisers Frauenlob, Elbing, Rostock and Wiesbaden, and the destroyers or heavy torpedo boats V-48, S-35, V-27, V-4 and V-29. However, the damaged capital ships told a different story. In terms of capital ships, the British vessels that were damaged and in need of repair were the battleships Barham, Warspite, Malaya, Colossus and Marlborough, and the battlecruisers Lion, Princess Royal, Tiger and New Zealand. Although of all of these, Colossus and New Zealand were only superficially damaged and could put to sea immediately again if needed. On the German side, the damage consisted of the battleships König, Großer Kurfürst, Markgraf, Kaiser, Helgoland and Schleswig-Holstein, all in need of repairs, along with the battlecruisers Derflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke and von der Tann, also likewise out of action. But on top of this, not counting cruisers and below, the time needed for repair was also very different. The day after the battle, the Royal Navy could still field 23 battleships and 4 battlecruisers and signalled itself ready for action. The German fleet was down to 10 operational battleships and no battlecruisers, and would not be able to sail for quite some time. By the end of the month, HMS Queen Elizabeth, Emperor of India, and HMAS Australia, all of whom had missed the battle, were back on the front line, as was HMS Royal Sovereign, which had just finished working up, leaving the British battle line actually stronger than it had been before the fight. Over July, Princess Royal, Barham, Tiger, and unbelievably Warspite came back into the fleet, with Lion following soon after, albeit still missing Q-turret. Whilst many of the German ships would also come back into action over these 2 months, a number, including several of the battlecruisers, would remain under repair for several months further. There would be no replacement for the lost Lützow until the next year when SMS Hindenburg was commissioned, and the only additional battleship of 1916 would be the Bayern, whilst the British would add the battleship Resolution to the ranks alongside the battlecruisers Renown and Repulse, with Ramillies arriving in 1917. In this respect, then, despite the greater losses inflicted, it was the High Seas Fleet that ended up at an overall greater numerical disadvantage after the battle for the rest of 1916, compounded by Scheer's understandable insistence that, apart from anything else, the battle had proved the pre-dreadnoughts should never sail with the High Seas Fleet again. Strategically, Scheer was very clear to his superiors the High Seas Fleet could not weather another battle like that, and with a summer excursion almost intercepted by the Grand Fleet again, he abandoned the idea of going after an isolated part of it. The Royal Navy was clearly wise to the tactic, and he had no intention of fighting the whole Grand Fleet in another set-piece battle. Instead, he would send portions of the High Seas Fleet after the Russians in 1917 and ramp up submarine warfare against the British instead. In terms of who won, then, there is no direct and unequivocal answer. On the strategic level, the British held the field at the end of the fighting, they still held control of the sea, and they had the stronger fleet the day after, and they deterred most of the further German efforts at contesting any of these. They also maintained the blockade of Germany, which would continue to have significant impacts on the German war industry and food supply. But, at the same time, the German fleet still existed in a fair amount of strength and had not suffered massive losses in the action, meaning that the Grand Fleet and the Battlecruiser fleet would still largely be confined to keeping an eye on the Germans for the rest of the war, instead of being able to act more directly elsewhere. Tactically, it's easy to point to overall losses and say that it's a flat-out loss for the British. However, as with the strategic side, it's actually, at least in my opinion, more nuanced than that. You really had 4 fleets at sea: the High Seas Fleet, First Scouting Group, the Battlecruiser Fleet, and the Grand Fleet, under Scheer, Hipper, Beatty, and Jellicoe respectively, and they fought some very separate actions. Whilst the various phases of the battle can be divided up in various ways, one of the more common sets of division is the run to the south, the run to the north, the First Fleet action, the Second Fleet action, and the night actions. But I think there's another way to look at it. Beatty versus Hipper, and Jellicoe versus Scheer. Now, the latter part, which comprises the last 3 phases of the traditional breakup of the battle, does include the battlecruisers of both sides and their commanders, but they're now in subordinate roles, whereas in the first 2 phases, it's basically Beatty versus Hipper. If we split those 2 actions at the point where the Grand Fleet opens fire at the High Seas Fleet at 1831, then the score, if you like, in the Beatty versus Hipper fight is British losses: the battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary, and Invincible, the armoured cruisers Black Prince and Warrior, and the destroyers Shark, Nomad, and Nestor. Whereas on the German side, they lose the light cruiser Wiesbaden and the destroyers V-27 and V-29. In addition, the British have Barham, Warspite, Malaya, Lion, Princess Royal, Tiger, and New Zealand all damaged, whilst on the German side, Lützow is badly damaged, with Derflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke, and von der Tann taking varying degrees of damage. After 1831, when it becomes Jellicoe versus Scheer, the British lose the armoured cruiser Black Prince, the flotilla leader Tipperary, and the destroyers Sparrowhawk, Turbulent, Ardent, and Fortune. Whereas the Germans lose the battlecruiser Lützow, the pre-dreadnought Pommern, the light cruisers Frauenlob, Elbing, and Rostock, and the destroyers V-28, S-35, and V-4. Damage-wise, the British have light damage to HMS Colossus and serious damage to HMS Marlborough, whilst on the German side, the battleships König, Großer Kurfürst, Markgraf, Kaiser, Helgoland, and Schleswig-Holstein are all damaged, and the battlecruisers Derflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke, and von der Tann are also all heavily damaged. Thus, I would argue that Jutland, tactically speaking, was a game of 2 halves. Hipper decisively won the first half against Beatty, but Jellicoe equally decisively won the second half against Scheer. Now, with that said, there were definitely technical lessons to be learned by all parties once the smoke had cleared. On the British side, a few major problems were identified: shell performance, communications, and the distressing habit of a number of ships to violently disassemble themselves when under fire. And there was a slightly less urgent but still identified area for improvement in gunnery as well, especially amongst the battlecruisers. Shell performance was worrying. Plenty of hits had been seen, and large fireballs resulting from these had been truly impressive, which led many to think that quite a few more German ships had been sunk than was actually the case, since a penetrating hit that generated that kind of explosion would surely have been fatal. The German habit of zigzagging under fire, and a number of their ships' propensity to heal quite considerably when doing so, contributed to this perception, as British observers would see what appeared to be a devastating hit or series of hits, followed by the German ship appearing to swerve out of line with a pronounced list, which they took as a sure indication of massive and rapid internal flooding. In fact, the increased heal of some ships was combining with a British shell failure. Specifically, many of the shells were detonating either near enough, on contact, or very shortly after starting to penetrate, which meant that the majority of their explosive power was being wasted into the air, which was the cause of the large explosions that the British observed, as opposed to getting deep into the ship and touching off some much larger detonation. only some of which would escape through the shell hole, and thus the two possible scenarios looked similar from a distance, and the British, not knowing about the shell performance issues, assumed the latter. The cause of this was twofold. In some respects, and at some angles of fall, especially at longer ranges, the British shells were too brittle and would just shatter. But more generally, at the closer ranges that much of the gunfire had been exerted at, the lyddite explosive that was used as the bursting charge was very powerful, but also highly sensitive. In a normal armour-piercing shell, the main charge should be relatively shockproof, requiring a fuse detonator to set it off. This fuse can then be set with a delay, which allows it to be initiated by impact, but only go off once the shell has gotten deeper into the target. However, it turned out that lyddite was so sensitive it could be initiated by the shock of impact without any reference to the fuse. As a result, several dozen hits to German belt, barbette, and turret armour that by all rights should have punched through and dealt horrendous damage to their targets by blowing open their sides, shattering their boilers and engines, tearing into magazines, or blowing apart turrets, merely, quote-unquote, stove in outer plates, broke off chunks of armour, or knocked turrets out of action, allowing the German ships to stay alive and, in many cases, stay fighting, in a few instances even bringing disabled guns back into action after some work whilst under fire. This issue alone, if properly addressed, had the potential to completely rewrite the table of losses for the battle, with one later analysis concluding that possibly up to half a dozen more German capital ships might have been sent to the bottom if proper shells had been used. But sadly, this wasn't entirely a new discovery. Jellicoe, back when he was 3rd Sea Lord at the height of the pre-war naval arms race, had recognised a number of these issues during gunnery trials and asked the Ordnance Board for new shells that corrected these issues to be developed. However, the issue had not been fully resolved by the time Jellicoe was assigned to a new post a few months later, and his successors had failed to follow up on the problem. The Germans themselves, upon analysis of the damage to their ships, recognised just how many lucky escapes they had enjoyed, with Hipper apparently later commenting that it was nothing but the poor quality of their bursting charges which saved us from disaster. Talk of British shell ineffectiveness rapidly became a point of laughter at German naval officers' gatherings, which gradually filtered through to the British via various shared social contacts in neutral navies. In a rather sad case of inertia, the Admiralty did not take this issue fully to heart, and it would only be when Jellicoe was promoted to First Sea Lord at the end of 1916 that he was able to take effective action, reallocating the existing shells to move the worst offenders into reserve, and starting the process of development on what would eventually become known as the Green Boy shells, which would eventually reach the fleet in early 1918, just in time for the last stand of the High Seas Fleet to not happen. Post-war, tests of these shells against the German battleship Baden showed the new type to have considerably improved performance. Communications was a vexing issue. Aside from the unspoken need to actually have signal officers who knew what they were doing, as the level of clarity and compliance with flag signals in basically every part of the Royal Navy that wasn't taking orders from HMS Lion had been a lot higher. That aside, there was a general acknowledgement that with so many ships spaced out over such distances, especially once funnel and gun smoke got involved, reading signal flags was somewhat difficult at the best of times before the gloomy weather and later darkness of the battlefield weighed in on top of that. Many of these same issues were present in the default backup to the signal flag, the signal lamp, which had the added hazard of being incidentally readable by the enemy, especially at night. This had allowed a number of German ships to get far closer without being fired upon than they should have by any rights, as well as the small side issue of the signal lamp pointing out exactly where you happen to be. Whilst radio was relatively widespread in the Grand Fleet, there had been a general reluctance to use it, which stemmed from an overextension of the relatively sensible policy of minimising radio signals during general sailing to reduce the chances of intercepts by the enemy. Whereas the Germans' much more liberal use of radio worked out better for them in battle, but at the same time was what had led to the Grand Fleet knowing that they were at sea in the first place. There was also the possibility of German jamming, and especially in the night action, a general reluctance to actually communicate with the higher echelons of command when it was mistakenly thought that they could see what was going on themselves. Or indeed, for many of those officers to actually show real initiative, and with the exceptions of desperate situations such as Windy Corner, or officers like Sturdy who were kept close to the centre of the fleet because it was felt he was a little too free-thinking. All of this would lead to a series of reforms, including new signals, greater freedom of action for squadron commanders, and explicit instructions to report what was seen, as well as exercise more independent thinking at all times, although many of these cultural changes would be more gradual and incremental than some of the more easily addressed purely technical issues. But perhaps the most immediate issue was why had 3 battlecruisers and 2 armoured cruisers detonated like gigantic floating bombs, with 1 or 2 other ships such as Lion only narrowly avoiding a similar fate. Here, the issues were many and complicated, not helped by a confusion of information, in part deliberate and in part accidental, in the years following the battle. And if that wasn't enough, even once that's all resolved, the details of the big ship losses are still not entirely uniform. A lot of coverage was given at the time, and later on, to apparent problems with the lack of armour on British battlecruisers of the time, and this was then conflated at some point to saying that the deck armour was insufficient. Well, this latter point can be immediately debunked. On no surviving ship was the deck armour ever breached, and indeed, when you calculate the angle of fall of shot, as well as the armour penetration and the range that the shots were being exchanged at Jutland, it becomes rapidly apparent that deck armour penetrations become not just exceedingly unlikely, but near enough physically impossible in almost all considered instances. The ranges involved too close and the angles of fall too shallow for a hazard to even be present on the relatively thin deck plating of World War I era capital ships. Belt and turret armour was a different matter, though. Although there were 2 sides to the battlecruiser engagement, there were really 3 broad families of ship design present at the time. The German ships were a fairly clear linear escalation of protection and firepower starting from der Tann. But the British contingent had 2 very different types of battlecruiser. The Invincible and Indefatigable classes were originally called Dreadnought Armoured Cruisers for a reason. They had no better protection in general than the armoured cruisers they replaced. In fact, the main turret faces were an inch thinner, and the Indefatigable's belt armour was in some places thinner than the Minotaurs and Warriors. Their protection was comprehensive against 5.9-inch or 8.2-inch shells if fired at a distance, which, to be fair, is what they were designed to fight and therefore to resist. But their 12-inch guns had prompted the Germans to build their own ships with that much larger caliber of shell in mind, and in return the German 11 and 12-inch gunfire was eminently capable of punching through any part of these 2 older ships' vertical armour at any range that the German guns could actually range out to, and later the ranges they could realistically expect to score hits, assuming broadside impacts, of course. Conversely, the British response to the German response, the Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, and Tiger, whilst not as heavily armoured as the German ships, did at least have 9 inches of armour on their main belt and turret faces, which was generally enough to stop an 11-inch shell at most reasonable ranges, and a 12-inch shell at medium to longer battle ranges, which was borne out in the absolute battering ships like Tiger experienced without any major breach of their protective systems. Thus, a general, British battlecruisers were far too weakly armoured assertion is lazy and not in keeping with the facts. However, the earlier battlecruisers were very vulnerable to penetrations, and that certainly didn't help. But in the end, the main problem was a combination of the propellants used and how they were handled. Both sides had entered the war with propellants that were somewhat at risk of burning uncontrollably in the event of a hit. Indeed, SMS Seydlitz had come within a hair of blowing itself up at the Battle of Dogger Bank when it had taken a hit because of this factor. But the British hadn't suffered such a hit in that or other similar engagements, and so the chance to learn a direct lesson before Jutland was missed. In addition, the British propellant, which consisted of various mixes of cordite, suffered from a number of issues, Whilst it was very energetic and thus hurled shells with considerable enthusiasm, the stabilizing agents deteriorated over time, and these would gradually leak crystals and dust of extremely flammable byproducts such as nitrocellulose. It was also stored in silk bags instead of metal casings for the most part, but these risks were manageable, and the ships had gone into service with a system of flash doors designed to block the propagation of the igniting flash of an explosion taking place somewhere near the magazines, along with strict controls about how many charges were allowed outside the magazine at any given time, as well as monitoring and replacement protocols for degraded cordite. But then the war started, and in a rather convoluted way, the lack of major modern coastal fortifications began a process that would end in multiple fatal magazine explosions. Because the coast was exposed, the first scouting group began raids designed to draw out the British fleet, and without fortifications, the British had to respond with capital ships. But Scapa Flow was too far away to protect Scarborough, even with Room 40 coming online. And so the fastest ships, the Battlecruiser fleet, were moved further south to Rosyth, where they could be closer and they would thus be able to counter the German raids. Whilst Scapa Flow was a vast anchorage in the middle of practically nowhere at the time, this allowed the Grand Fleet to conduct regular gunnery practice. But the Battlecruiser fleet's new home was in the Firth of Forth, the estuary of the River Forth, near Edinburgh. Not only was this body of water far too narrow to allow long-range gunnery practice, but the sounds of heavy naval gunfire and the resulting explosions would not have gone down too well with the local residents. Heading out to sea for gunnery practice on a regular basis was both expensive and somewhat dangerous, the various encounters with U-boats and mines resulting in the loss of HMS Aboukir, Hogue, Cressy and Audacious, weighing rather heavily on any decision to deploy outside of battle in those early years of the war. This in turn led to a degradation in the Battlecruiser fleet's ability to conduct accurate long-range gunnery, and so a substitute was found that also seemed to suit the conditions of the anchorage: rate of fire. Specifically, the practice of making good long-range gunnery estimates quickly couldn't be maintained. Then, it was reasoned, the ability to rapidly fire the guns would make up for this, as multiple half salvos in quick succession would in theory allow a ship to walk its shells onto the target in about the same time that a slower and more precise vessel might find the range by the normal method. However, this rate of fire exceeded the speed at which the various flash doors and interlocks allowed fresh ammunition to be brought up from the magazines, and so these safety devices, depending on which report you believe, were either removed or wedged open in order to let shells and charges pass faster. This still wasn't quite enough, and so additional charges would be stored in the turrets and working chambers as well, giving a head start to the stockpile that the now faster ammunition transport system would in theory be able to keep topped up long enough for an exchange of gunnery to conclude. If one could hit fast enough, then again, in theory at least, return fire wouldn't be a problem, because you'd knock out the enemy before they could get your range. To be clear, the general idea of improving fire rates and thus needing more ammunition dated back to before the war and appears to have been spread into some degree throughout the entire Royal Navy. But it was the above combination of factors that ramped up an already somewhat unsafe practice to a disastrous one in the Battlecruiser fleet. As the war went on and more fast Queen Elizabeths became available, a system was developed to get the Battlecruiser fleet back into the accurate gunnery game by rotating squadrons up to Scapa Flow for practice, and indeed it was this that saw 5th Battle Squadron sail with Beatty and 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron sail with Jellicoe on the day of the battle. The benefit of the gunnery training being seen in Invincible's takedown of Lutzow in her brief window of engagement. It's also notable that one of the reasons Tiger was able to survive the immense battering she endured was that when the new ship arrived in the Battlecruiser fleet and was instructed in the various methods prescribed to increase his rate of fire, Tiger's captain promptly smiled, saluted, and then went back to his ship and refused to implement most of them. Indeed, even elsewhere, the feeling was getting around that things had gotten perhaps a little bit too unsafe, as aboard HMS Lion the gunners were also putting in place measures to cut down on the number of propellant charges outside the magazines and closing up some of the flash doors again, which likely helped when it came to the battle. But what these practices resulted in was a system whereby, in the event of an impact that got through the turret roof, sides, or some other part of the turret or barbette arrangement, instead of there being a small flare-up and a few dozen casualties, instead a much larger burn of cordite would occur. This would travel along open ammunition handling systems, and because of the greater pressure caused by the stacked charges, even if the flash doors were closed, they weren't designed to handle this excessive overpressure, and either way the fire would reach the magazines. Once there, unless already flooded, as had happened with Lion's Q turret, the magazine would burn, and the ship would briefly turn into a gigantic pipe bomb. What happened in Lion's turret was also indicative of what could happen elsewhere. The hit itself didn't cause the deadly overflash, but a flare-up of fire sometime afterwards, triggered by a still hot piece of metal, did. In like manner, both explosions aboard the Indefatigable, the first that blew off the stern and crippled it, and the second that detonated the forward magazines, appear to have been separated from the actual hits, that most likely are the root cause of them, by about 30 seconds or more. Internally, at least, within a week of the battle, the Royal Navy was relatively sure that these practices were the cause, or at least a large part of it, and further interviews of survivors later in the year backed up these findings. Whilst he had let the problem develop under his command, to give him at least some credit, Beatty acted fairly quickly in the aftermath, issuing a number of instructions for improvements, some of them new, others as horrifyingly simple as reinstalling flash protection that had been removed. On the positive side, the Grand Fleet itself was relatively satisfied that its centrally controlled director-firing system was generally superior to the Germans, allowing them to score more hits, although whatever pact with the higher powers that Iron Duke's gunners had was apparently not replicable across the fleet. That said, it was recommended to upgrade the fleet to the newer, larger range finders that had been found on the Queen Elizabeths and the R's, whilst also extending director firing provisions to include fitting on smaller ships as well as battleships' secondary batteries. On the German side, there were two main problems they recognised on a technical level: lack of firepower and lack of gun range. In both cases, these were issues the Germans had already to an extent recognised, but the fact that both Tiger and Princess Royal had taken multiple hits from German guns without too much impediment, whilst even a handful of hits from the faulty but considerably larger British shells had rendered a number of their own battlecruisers combat ineffective despite their greater protection, underlined that the 11-inch gun was not really up to combat with more modern ships of the Royal Navy, and the 12-inch gun was probably marginal. The Bayern class had already moved up to 15-inch guns from the 12-inch guns of the Königs, and on the battlecruiser side, the Hindenburg had already been launched, so little could be done there, but the first 4 of 7 planned Mackensen class were well under construction. This rendered them far too costly to rebuild with a larger armament, although they had already been planned with 350mm or 13.8-inch guns, but the last 3 hadn't been laid down yet, and so the design was modified to the Ersatz York class, for which these vessels would see an upgrade of 15-inch guns to match the Bayerns. Likewise, the plans for Bayern's planned successor, the L-20E Alphas, were dusted off, and the armament was likewise increased, this time from 15-inch guns to 420mm or 16.5-inch guns. When it came to range, again, the gun elevations had already been somewhat increased on a number of ships, but now the new designs were altered to have even higher elevation from the start, and in-service vessels were pulled in to have their own turrets opened up somewhat to further increase maximum elevation and thus range. Hipper had been acutely aware of potentially being outranged in his combats, and whilst Beatty's errors had let him get in range whilst the battlecruiser fleet threw away that particular advantage, the fact that the Queen Elizabeths had been able to engage several minutes before he could even begin to attempt a reply weighed heavily on his post-battle recommendations. In the long run, the High Seas Fleet would rarely emerge looking for a fleet action, and indeed would be withdrawn if it seemed that the Grand Fleet was out. In 1918, when faced with an order to sail against the British, who had now been augmented by the 6th Battle Squadron made up of American warships, the sailors of the High Seas Fleet mutinied instead. The bulk of the fleet would then be brought into Scapa Flow under the guns of the Grand Fleet, later to scuttle itself when it appeared that the fleet was to be surrendered to the victorious Allies. Having served alongside Hipper in First Scouting Group, the later-to-be Admiral Raeder would go on to command the Kriegsmarine for most of the Second World War. The Royal Navy would take the lessons of Jutland to heart. Control was loosened, aggression was encouraged, and night fighting training was intensified. Many of the officers present at Jutland would go on to command theatres and fleets in the Second World War, setting a tone for the Royal Navy's conduct in that particular conflict. But never again would massed battle fleets confront each other on the high seas. The Washington Treaty would see the end of such fast battle lines in and of themselves, and the next time the great fleets of the world faced off, it would be with them scattered across the world in a dozen smaller actions, all under the shadow of aircraft and aircraft carriers, which would eventually supplant the battleship as the capital ship of a major navy.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.